listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for our last edition this week of the most disruptive show covering news and events in those divided states as well as across our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, getting into the headlines this morning. First up in COVID news, maps tracking new coronavirus infections in the continental United States were bathed in a sea of red on Friday morning, with every state showing the virus spreading with worrying speed. More than 250,000 people have died in the U.S., a number that grew by another 1,962 on Thursday. That was very closely matched to the increases on Wednesday. The COVID Tracking Project reported that more than 80,000 people were in the hospital, the highest number since the pandemic began. The letter does not mandate the schools comply with Gill's request. Every school was asked to notify the Department of Health and Human Services by December 4th whether it plans to move to an all-virtual model or continue offering in-person instruction. Mexico, meanwhile, has recorded more than 100,000 deaths from COVID-19. That is the fourth country to pass that milestone at this point. Government officials there have acknowledged that the true toll from the pandemic is likely higher. Only the U.S., Brazil, and India have recorded more deaths than Mexico, which has a population of roughly 125 million. Its mortality rate of 9.8% is one of the highest in the world. Digital culture and news company BuzzFeed has agreed to buy HuffPost from Verizon Media, the companies announced Thursday, a move that combines two of the internet's largest consumer media properties. Verizon will also make an investment and become a minority shareholder in BuzzFeed, and the deal will see the two companies partner on shopping experiences for consumers, content syndication access across each other's platforms, and ad products. BuzzFeed paid for HuffPost with company shares, the value of which was not disclosed. A big presser yesterday from the Trump legal team, including Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, lawyers for the Trump campaign, in which Giuliani laid out a wide variety of anecdotal cases for voter fraud, and Powell blamed international leftists for hacking into machines, including the ghost of Hugo Chavez. Jamarl, I'm sure you saw this. What were your thoughts on this?
I did a video on this a few days ago. They were basically arguing that communists were responsible for getting Joe Biden elected. Hugo Chavez, I think they said likely China. And I thought that was great. They said Cuba, Venezuela, and likely China. It's like, you didn't know? You weren't certain? You weren't sure? Why were you so definitive about the first two, Venezuela and Cuba, but you were kind of doubtful of China? Yeah, Giuliani was waving around these affidavits and stuff like that. Look, take it to a court of law, buddy. Don't show me. Show the court of law. I will give you more credence to it if you take it to a court of law. He is in Pennsylvania yesterday arguing that the election should be overturned in Pennsylvania. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's getting laughable. In Michigan, the lawsuit is fizzled. And yeah, in Pennsylvania, they're trying to get the judge, who was incredulous, by the way, at their assertion, to overturn the results, which likely is not going to happen. Yeah, show those affidavits to the judge, and then I will give you a little bit more leeway. But up to this point, he's America's crazy uncle from my standpoint. It's insane.
I hear you. What's frustrating for me is listening to the first part of the presser yesterday. Giuliani's talking about all these different anecdotal cases of voter fraud, and most of them are like up close in person, where people are saying, person A, I was here, I was watching, and then person A, threw ballots away, or they included them, or they rescanned them multiple times, that kind of thing. A bunch of anecdotal cases in person, and then Powell came on and was talking about larger cases of, again, communist foreign interference, leftist foreign interference, whatever, a completely separate tack. I mean, you can coordinate them in some sense. I get what you're saying. Michigan's a little bit more complicated, just because the Republicans, at least one of them, has actually voted to rescind their vote. They've moved to rescind their vote. They sent in an affidavit on that. That was night before last that came out. We actually mostly missed that on yesterday's show, sadly.
Well,
I don't know. We'll see where this stuff is going.
Just to interrupt real quick, I actually did get it. I covered it. They rescinded the vote. So, but it's moot. It doesn't matter. It's theatrics, right? I mean, at the end of the day, Donald Trump called one of them, and the person came back and said, okay, we're rescinding our vote. We were being threatened. But there's no legal mechanism to do that. Meaning, did the people who rescinded their vote know that there was no legal mechanism, and for the most part just wanted to retain the optics of backing Donald Trump? I suspect there's more of that. But I could be wrong.
Well, but it's also...
Well, go for it.
I hear what you're saying. No, yeah, if there's no legal mechanism, that complicates things. But in some sense, this is all theatrics. In other words, it's all optics. Politics is a series of different optical moves that different parties make. And if they vote to rescind, then that still might have an effect, even legally, potentially, if they decide to go forward with it. Anyway, that's a little bit above my head at this point. But just throwing that in there. New York authorities, in another headline here, New York authorities investigating the Trump Organization have expanded their inquiries to include tax write-offs involving millions of dollars in consulting fees. Investigators with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which is conducting a broad criminal investigation, and the New York Attorney General's Office, which has a civil inquiry underway, have subpoenaed the Trump Organization seeking records relating to the consulting fees. The subpoenas were in response to a New York Times investigation into President Donald Trump's tax returns. They first disclosed that he took $26 million in write-offs that came from fees he paid to consultants, including an apparent $747,000 fee that the Times said matched a payment disclosed by Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump. The New York Times first reported the subpoenas had been sent. There is no suggestion that Ivanka Trump accounted for the payment improperly. Representatives for the Manhattan District Attorney, New York Attorney General, and Trump Organization declined to comment. Ivanka Trump reacted to the Times story Thursday evening, tweeting, quote, "This is harassment, pure and simple. The inquiry by NYC Democrats is 100% motivated by politics, publicity, and rage. They know very well that there's nothing here and that there was no tax benefit whatsoever. These politicians are simply ruthless," end quote. Meanwhile, in the Nagorno-Karabakh, thankfully former conflict at this point, I'm sure there's still tension there, but the outright war has stopped. Azerbaijan forces have entered a district bordering Nagorno-Karabakh as it begins retaking territory held for nearly 30 years by the Armenian-backed government as part of a Russian-brokered peace deal. Video showed troops and armored vehicles moving into the district of Agdam, which Armenia conceded in a controversial armistice, just a day after columns of its soldiers and tanks rolled out of the territory. Armenia will also hand over the Kalbajar district wedged between the Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia on 25th of November, and the Lashin district by the 1st of December. On Thursday, Armenian residents of Agdam hurriedly picked up pomegranates and persimmons from trees surrounding their homes and packed vans with furniture before fleeing ahead of the official deadline to cede the mountainous province. Tens of thousands of Azerbaijanis are expected to return to the region. On Friday, Azerbaijan quickly organized prayers at a local mosque to signal the return of the city to the control of the Muslim nation. Political tensions have remained high in Armenia, where the truce was viewed by many as a capitulation by the government of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. On Friday, several Armenian news sources reported that the Minister of Defense, David Tonoyan, had tendered his resignation in what, if confirmed, would be another exit of a high-ranking official from his cabinet. The country's foreign minister resigned earlier this week, and its president, Armen Sarkisian, had called for Pashinyan to step down and allow snap elections to lead the country out of the crisis. Burundi is no longer welcoming the United Nations Special Envoy to the East African nation, asserting that peace has been achieved after a deadly political crisis. In a letter sent to the UN Secretary General and seen by the Associated Press, Burundi's foreign minister said the office has no more reason to be there. It will close by the end of the year. Quote, after a successful electoral process which led to a historic political transition, peaceful and exemplary in Africa, the government of Burundi finds that a UN presence with a political character is no longer relevant, end quote. He asserted that the office, quote, kept Burundi in a psychosis of artificial crisis, cleverly maintained by foreign actors, end quote. Burundi has achieved peace, security, and stability, he asserted. A source at the office of the special envoy to Burundi confirmed the letter. The office opened in 2016 in the wake of deadly political unrest around former President Pierre Nkurunziza's ultimately successful decision to pursue another term. The office had a mandate to help Burundi's government engage in dialogue with its opponents and critics. Nkurunziza died earlier this year, shortly after an election he didn't contest, and current President Evariste Ndayishimiye has spoken of moving on from the past, but human rights groups and other watchdogs have warned they see little change from the repressive ways of the previous administration. Meanwhile, over in Uganda, the death toll from protests over the arrest of Ugandan opposition presidential hopeful and musician Bobi Wine has risen to 37 people, police said Friday. This is the country's worst unrest in a decade, and more is expected ahead of the election early next year. The Uganda police pathologist and the head of police health services told journalists in the capital, Kampala, that they had counted 37 bodies by Thursday morning. This protest broke out on Wednesday after police arrested Wine, who is expected to appear in court on Thursday in the eastern town of Iganga. Police accused him of flouting COVID-19 guidelines that require presidential candidates to address less than 200 people. Police have said 350 people were arrested and detained throughout Kampala. Tension remained in the capital Thursday with a heavy military and police presence. Wine, who has been arrested many times in recent years, has captured the imagination of many Ugandans with his persistent calls for President Yoweri Museveni to retire after 36 years in power. Meanwhile, big tech company Apple has agreed to pay millions of dollars to 34 states over its controversial previous practice of deliberately slowing down older iPhones to extend their battery life. The company will pay $113 million to settle an investigation by states, including California and Arizona, over how Apple wasn't transparent about its iPhone battery problems that led to unexpected device shutdowns. Instead of disclosing the issue to consumers or replacing the batteries, it pushed a software update in December 2016 that impacted the performance of older iPhone models. News of the practice upset Apple consumers, igniting what some called Batterygate. Many believed it was an effort to encourage users to buy new iPhones. I remember dealing with that. I remember seeing that problem. I think I've even had to deal with that problem myself, which is why I'm a little bit confused that they say that it's a former problem. Not only has my just replaced my phone, actually, a couple of circumstances. Not only was my former phone getting slower and slower over the years, but its battery life was also going down, and I can't help but think that maybe they were related. I don't know. You ever had that problem, Jamarl?
Yeah, it's called planned obsolescence. It's
absolutely
profitable for a company to force you to buy a particular product sooner than that product would typically need to be bought. If you were Apple and you were producing iPhones, if you created an iPhone that had a great battery life that lasts over a period of time, then the people wouldn't necessarily need to buy the next iPhone. So it is makes all sense in the world from the standpoint of your wallet or your bottom line, and to make that product fail sooner than what it could typically fail. It makes them more profit. So yeah.
It does. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Here's another take, though. I'm like, I'll be honest. I was reading that headline, and while I was reading it, my mind was going to exactly that criticism, a criticism of capitalism per se. But then here's another take that I came up with as a sort of devil's advocate response to your thing, which is, wouldn't it also so I was considering switching. I use iPhones primarily, but I was considering switching to like an Android or some other model because of that. I was like, I'm frustrated by this. This phone was expensive. I don't want to have to pay for another expensive phone. Why don't I just switch? Wouldn't it, in some sense, especially because Apple has this business model where they make sense through their app store, like, why don't they try to go against that? If there were a company like that went against the grain and instead tried to extract money from me in some other more sort of like sustainable way, like through the app store, for instance, or through these other, smaller app purchases on the phone. I don't know, man. I know that they make a lot of money through their phones.
But they do.
And planned obsolescence is absolutely a thing.
But they get all of it. I mean, they get the money from the app store, but they also get money from you getting it. And frankly, it's kind of like politics, right? If everybody does it, you don't have an option to get out of it in the first place. So it's like, yeah, we're going to ding you for the apps, but we're also going to ding you for the phone. There's no way out.
It would be good. And again, part of it is their argument is that technological progress is always, this is an argument that they make, but each phone has some better camera than the last one. But like at a certain point, these things are probably just good enough. And I guess for different people, there's going to be a different year at which their phone was good enough. For a lot of people, it could be like 1996. For other people, it might be like 2034. It still might not have happened yet. But I guess the point is, what if we made phones to last? And what if there were like an open source consortium of hardware and software developers who are working in concert you see what I'm saying, to create open phone models that you could like replace the battery every once in a while and you just kind of keep on kicking with it. That's in this sort of
Shane, you sounded like a
system
communist right now. You
It's
sounded like a commie. Commie! Commie! Who is this commie? No, I feel you, man. And of course I agree with you.
I hear you. All right. You know what? You got to close this out. You guys are listening to Headlines on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are going into a break. And on the other side of this short break, you guys will have the opportunity to listen to Jamarl Thomas's monologue. You guys are also listening to Fault Lines with both Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Hey, Jamarl, I got your clips ready.
Lines. We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in DC. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share this video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes our show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Definitely feel free to call in. I don't like saying this, and if I'm being honest, maybe I do like saying it. At least my wife likes to say I would prefer a friend or prefer to win an argument as opposed to losing a friend, meaning I can accept the loss of a friend if I am right. She believes I am that way. She is more inclined to just kind of let it rest if it will keep things copacetic. I'm not that way, and I am not going to be that way right now. And I'm not doing this purely for ego points. I'm doing this because I want to make the point and drive this into the ground for later. If there is a testament that they were patriots that were actually pushing back against the tide of the left and their acquiescence, and then turning around later on saying, we need to push back against this. No, you should have been pushing back against this during the election. You should have been pushing back against this during the primary. And you don't get to come back now, all of a sudden, with this kind of prescience of we're going to push back and push against Joe Biden now. Now it's too late. Now Joe Biden is already in office. And when I told you, breathlessly said over and over and over again, that when Biden gets in that office, all ability to influence him goes up in smoke. I was right. And I want that to be known the next 4 years and the next 4 years after that. So when Democrats and the left, or people who claim to be on the left, come back with the exact same argument that you got to support this inert candidate, this worthless candidate, even if we're in the midst of something like a Great Depression, or for that matter, a pandemic. You don't get to come back later and say, now we're going to push him. Because fact of the matter is you're wrong. And from a political strategy standpoint, you are going to end up with a worse scenario later on because of the bad strategy that you're using now. AOC comes out with a tweet, which basically inspired this entire monologue. I have time today because I am sick and tired of seeing powerful people who have hands deep in the cookie jar turn around and tell people there's nothing in there for them or the country's future. It's rank hypocrisy and corruption, incompetence at its best. We shouldn't tolerate it. But you do tolerate it. You voted for it. You out there and advertise for it. You push people. You push lefties to go get Biden, and not just push lefties. You even made this argument that we can push him on the Green New Deal. When after the election, there was a more honest interview where you were talking about not even wanting to be in Congress because you realize they recognize you as an enemy. When you have Bustos, the DSCCC, or the DCC that is taking steps to blacklist you and people who back challenges to incumbents, to dinosaurs. You knew this before, and yet you still push for Joe Biden. And to whine and complain after the fact, you don't get to do that. You don't get to do that. You knew in advance that Joe Biden wasn't going to be pushed on these policies. A man who tells people, go vote for somebody else, when those people are asking him to support policy that the overwhelming majority of the public supports. You have no pressure, leverage on an individual like that, especially when they get in office. If you didn't have the stones to push him before, you have no power after. That's the honest and truth of it. Let's hear another one, Sanders. Let's hear Sanders make this argument about how the Democratic strategy, there are too many people who aren't necessarily backing lefty policies. Let's play the clip.
Thank you. Mr. President, you are going to take questions. Are you not going to? Are you really not going to take questions? All of you need to answer this.
Why is the federal
Let's
What's
kill that
going
one.
on? You're not working with.
Let's kill that one. We had some difficulties this morning, and the clips apparently got in reverse. That was a different clip. Let's play the next one.
Lost. I would say, really, to answer your question, that we have too many Democrats who are not giving their constituents a real choice, in the sense of telling them that they are prepared to stand up in a very strong way for working families and take on very powerful special interests today who are doing phenomenally well while ordinary people are suffering. So I think what we need is to move the Democratic Party in a direction we're not in right now. Right now, let's be honest about it. Donald Trump has won a strong majority of working class people in this country. Now, you know enough about the Democratic Party that 40 or 50 years ago, that would have been a laughable idea. Am I right?
Absolutely.
And yet that's where we are today. Why is that? And the answer is, I think that ordinary people out there in rural America and all parts of America do not see a party that says to the insurance companies and the drug companies, stop.
Ordinary people don't see a party that tells insurance companies and all of these other companies that they're working in their interests. Now, Sanders correlates that with Democrats losing. Think about it for a moment. There was a point where the Democratic Party owned the House of Representatives, owned it for like 50 years. It was believed that Republicans couldn't take the House. That's how long they owned it in such perpetuity. Not anymore. When Bill Clinton took office and Glass-Steagall, repeal of Glass-Steagall, the explosion of the prison population, telecommunications, or the deregulation of the Telecommunications Act, destruction of welfare, all of these policies, the willingness to privatize Social Security, they lost it all. They repudiated the working class, and the working class went elsewhere. Now, they believe that they can scrounge up enough in order to get over the finish line. I just want to make the point clear that Sanders recognizes that Democratic Party not backing the working class is the thing that's associated with them losing. By the same token, he continues to back the Democratic Party in them not backing the working class. You're incentivizing this behavior. I'm trying to make the point to you that you, Sanders, consciously recognize that you going out there pushing for Biden, you making this argument about the task force and everything else, when it's very clear, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, that those things are just suggestions. And at the end of the day, he was telling his donors, don't pay attention to that stuff. I'm making a point to you that you're backing a party with a strategy that loses. And yet you continue to back the party with that losing strategy, incentivizing that very same losing strategy. And this is not just people like Sanders. This is also the radicals, the people who are the radicals of the bunch, people who I love greatly. Still, in this election, came out and said, vote Biden. Let's hear the clip for Cornel West.
I'm convinced that the Biden-Harris presidency could very well be a third of.
Basically, it could be a third or fourth Obama term. And this kind of basic argument that Cornel West, if you remember correctly, Cornel West pushed for people to back Biden. He went to the People's Forum, the People's Party, and pushed for people to back Joe Biden, despite pushing for these good policies, despite pushing for healthcare, all of these other things. He's a radical, in the clearest sense of the term, radical. Love the guy. My wife loves the guy. And yet, he still told people to back Biden. And in this particular moment, saying, we need to be vigilant about not having a third Obama presidency. How? How? If you didn't have the gumption to push him before the election, cowardice compels no leverage. And let's just be very clear, the entire reason that one was willing to push Biden over Trump was cowardice, not patriotic. It was cowardice. And it's a strategy that will bite in the end later on when the Democrats can't muster anything because they never believed anything in the first place. And all of those lefties that backed them left and right pushed for Joe Biden and then complained after the fact. It's too late. Erin Brockovich wrote an article, and Brockovich basically made the point that Joe Biden is bringing people in his administration that were backing the chemical industry as they were dumping and getting people injured. The environmentalist movement is angry at Joe Biden because of the person he's putting in as the liaison for the environmentalist movement. I hate to tell all of you this, but this is going to be a long series of disappointments. You've been exploited. You've been had. And it was as obvious as can be that you were going to be had. Don't wring your hands now after the fact when it was perfectly clear in the beginning. Shane, what do you have to say? Yes, I'm a little annoyed by these guys and the way that they're coming out after the fact saying, hey, you got to hold them accountable. How? How?
Yeah, well, as I saw somebody saying in one of these chat rooms, well, we're almost to the midterm elections, aren't we? So I mean, is it like at this point, shouldn't you be holding back? Shouldn't you be holding back on Biden because you're getting ready for another election where if you start to hammer Biden, I mean, this is the thing, you just get sucked in like gravitationally by the effects of these larger parties and their incentives. And at a certain point, I know a lot of people just push away. They just reject it. They're just sick of it. They're cynical and they're tired of the whole thing. And that's part of the system too. That's the system sort of failing to fill the needs of its members, failing to do the duties that you would expect it to do. And in its own way, that's okay. I've been thinking about this. Like, where am I supposed to fit into this in my own very, very small way? Like, what should I be pushing for? Yes, you should be pushing to fix the system to the extent that that's possible. But also, like, if you can make people more powerful in their own communities, in their own lives, if you can give people some of the tools they need to solve their problems to the extent that they can, to the extent that their problems aren't society's problems, then you should do so. And that's what I'm left with. And it's just a question of how to do it. Does that make sense, Jamarl? What's your take?
That does make sense. And there is one other part to this. We don't negotiate with terrorists. In fact, that's what I wanted to start off with it when I originally wrote this. Got turned around after the fact. But basically, people in the Biden camp, people who are associated with, in the Democratic strategists, basically argued we don't negotiate with terrorists. And he's talking about the left. Because the left was exposing opposition research on the people Biden was bringing into his cabinet, saying this guy is a person of the party, this guy is horrible on environmental legislation, this other person is horrible as a hawk, this guy wanted to privatize Social Security, like opposition research. And Biden campaign is like, yeah, we don't negotiate with terrorists or people associated with the Biden campaign, saying that, look, you're going to get rid of our goodwill. And going farther and said those task force that they had already said in the Washington Post were just suggestions, gave this idea of goodwill for the Biden camp. Basically, shut up and leave us alone.
You don't negotiate with terrorists, but also don't try to negotiate with tyrants because they're not going to care. If you've got a monopoly, a business monopoly, you can't negotiate with that. They're a wall of incentives and self-interest. Same thing with a political monopoly. Like you don't try to negotiate with it. Boycotting it, refusing to give them your vote, that's sort of one step back. That's one step up the chain. But if you keep going, ultimately, I think what you should try to do is to the best of your abilities, you undo them, you unmake them. They're a monopoly. They should not be a monopoly. They can't monopolize your access to power, frankly, in our society. They shouldn't be able to do that. So whatever you can to uproot them, you got to do. Don't negotiate with terrorists, but don't negotiate with tyrants either. We got to go into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break. Stay tuned, folks.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guest, Mark Sloboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. Mark, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
Great to have you. All right, we're talking here about Nagorno-Karabakh. We last spoke with you a few weeks ago, right after the armistice, right after the ceasefire began, Russian-mediated ceasefire, effectively after Azerbaijan took over this one district, also right in the sort of same 24, 36-hour period as they shot down a Russian helicopter. Both of those events seem to have triggered a successful ceasefire, a successful peace. Armenia's political system, however, is in chaos. Nikol Pashinyan the president has called for Nikol Pashinyan to step down. As far as I know, he has not yet done so, although different members of his cabinet are being pushed out, probably to try to make some small movement so that he doesn't have to actually step down himself. But that seems to be a matter of time at this point. That's Armenia. Broadly, though, the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh seems to have eased. The tensions have eased, at least for now. Mark, what's going on over there? What are you seeing?
So, yeah, what you said is exactly right. First of all, in terms of the ceasefire, okay, the difference between this ceasefire and the 4 failed ceasefires that preceded it, first of all, is that Azerbaijan has largely concluded more than their original war aims, and Armenia is was facing complete collapse, and they basically had no choice but to accept a ceasefire very strongly in favor on Azerbaijani terms. But more so, this ceasefire is already enforced on the ground by some mutually agreed upon 2,000 Russian peacekeepers, along another stretch, a new transport corridor that the Armenian government had to agree to opening across their territory to connect the Azerbaijani exclave of Nakhchivan, nestled up against Turkey on the far side of Armenia, through Armenia, with Azerbaijan proper. And that will actually be patrolled by Russia's FSB Border Patrol Service. So Russians in Armenia, Russians in Azerbaijan, and of course Russians in the still unsettled status of the majority of Nagorno-Karabakh itself, the majority of which outside of the second city, Shusha or Shushi, depending on which side of the conflict you're on, still remains in ethnic Armenian hands. So the political consequences on the Azerbaijani side is that there is joy. This is a huge political and military success for their president, Aliyev. There's celebrations on the streets of Baku and reconstruction in the recovered territories, the 7 territories that had been occupied by Armenia since the 1990s ceasefire that froze the conflict then. Meanwhile, on the other side, there certainly is political chaos in Armenia, as the Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, who came to power just 2 years ago in what is regarded by many a street revolution, regarded by many as a color revolution, a prime minister who controversially tried to steer the country towards the West and away from Russia, found that, surprisingly enough, Russia didn't step in, didn't intervene to protect the occupied territories that they still held in Azerbaijan. And Pashinyan is being blamed both for the conduct of the war and for his lack of preparation. The ministers and other officials he had in place before the conflict began, who led to this disastrous, completely catastrophic defeat and complete reversal of what happened during the 1990s. There have been very large and continuing protests in Yerevan calling for him to step down. He has had opposition leaders arrested, protesting opposition leaders off the streets. He's claimed that there was a coup plot against him, and including an assassination of himself, which obviously, if there was, it failed. For the hours after the deal was signed that night, there was complete chaos in Yerevan. Government buildings were stormed. His political leaders were attacked. His allies, in fact, the speaker of the Armenian parliament was literally dragged out of his car by protesters angry over what they view as a capitulation. He was dragged from his car and beaten to within an inch of his life. So his condition continues to be extremely precarious there. Practically all of the political opposition in the country has called for him to step down. His own president, largely a ceremonial position, has called for him to step down, but he is remaining defiant, saying that he now needs to lead through the country through this catastrophe he has brought it to. There is literally, good reason to blame him for sparking this, beyond just non-preparation. Very controversially, when he assumed office, it was thought that he would do the opposite, that he would be, very prone towards cutting a deal with Azerbaijan, likely trading back those militarily occupied territories in return for some type of autonomy or other status for Nagorno-Karabakh. Instead, within the last year, he flew to Nagorno-Karabakh and said things that no Armenian prime minister has ever said, that Nagorno-Karabakh, not only is it not part of Azerbaijan, it's not that it's independent, but that it is part of Armenia. And these words were viewed as extremely inflammatory and a rhetorical escalation that Baku just could not, stand. And shortly thereafter, they went to war.
Mark, I don't know how Pashinyan stays in office at this point. I honestly don't know how he retains this position. I was watching after it was signed. I was following the news there. And like you said, the speaker was beat up. They apparently put the guy in the hospital, riots, ransacking parliament. And yet he's still clinging to power in this kind of odd way. Also, there's a secondary part to that about fault. So it was clear that Azerbaijan was upping their weapons. It was clear that at the very least seemed to have some kind of allegiance with Turkey. And like you said, he was being pretty provocative in some of his statements, Pashinyan. Could he have cut a deal? I mean, with the level of hostility towards, any notion, meaning Armenia accepted Nagorno-Karabakh as its own, or at the very least, ethnically its territory to some degree. Would they have ever been able to cut a deal where he could exchange some of that territory back for a certain degree of autonomy? Meaning, was there any propensity for a deal to be made there based on what the population considered as potentially their own territory?
Yes, I think there were grounds. He did come to power in Armenia with a high degree of total control of the country. He swept out the old political order, basically kind of purged the Armenian parliament, so that he had a working power base there. It was expected that he would make a deal. And we know that Azerbaijan was willing to entertain ideas about a deal back when there were 7 occupied territories that could have been traded back without conflict. Then now they had lost all that leverage and had nothing to argue back, and even had to agree to this transport corridor for Azerbaijan across Armenia itself. Putin has revealed just in the past few days in an interview with Russian journalists about the conflict that at the just around October 20th, so just about a month ago, before any of Nagorno-Karabakh itself had fallen into Azerbaijani hands, most particularly the second city, Shusha or Shushi, that there was a deal presented by Putin, which the president of Azerbaijan had accepted, that would have provided autonomy for all of Nagorno-Karabakh, and a transport and a corridor, the Lachin corridor, would have remained in ethnic Armenian hands in return for the return of the rest of the occupied territories. But the condition was that Azerbaijani refugees would be allowed to return to the homes that they had been driven from some 3 decades ago. Now, during the first phase of the conflict in the 1990s, when Armenia was triumphant, some 600 to 700,000 Azerbaijan were driven, ethnically cleansed from their homes by Armenian forces from the occupied territories, but also from Nagorno-Karabakh itself, where they were a minority. But in the second city, in Shushi, they were a majority. They were driven from that city. But evidently the Armenian prime minister felt that that was unacceptable to the interests of Armenia. And he did not accept that deal. And the results was that he lost part of Nagorno-Karabakh itself, Shushi, literally that second city, to Azerbaijan. And now Nagorno-Karabakh, such as that exists in ethnic Armenian hands, has lost even Shushi. So that, I think, is another political hammer blow descended on Pashinyan. And he has not stepped down yet, but I think he will find it very hard to govern in the face of this shame and anger that's directed to him by the Armenian populace, including by a great many of his former supporters who have lost faith with him after all of this, especially if that deal was indeed on the table and he turned it down, and he could have at least salvaged all of Nagorno-Karabakh out of it, but he didn't.
Wow.
And for a while now, wow. It's been, it's been clear that Pashinyan has not been willing to sign on to that kind of thing. I want to talk more about that when we come back, as well as the ethnic cleansing you were talking about, the wider consequences for the region, where this is going. But back in early 2019, in January of 2019, Pashinyan and Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, met for the World Economic Forum, and during that meeting, apparently, during that event, Pashinyan told reporters that he wouldn't sign on to any land for peace deal. And a quote, "We can't even discuss the lands for peace formula," end quote. That's a little bit separate from what you're talking about with the migration rights. But regardless, we're joined by Mark Sloboda. He's a geopolitical analyst. You can check him out on Twitter at MarkSloboda1. Also find him on Facebook, facebook.com/Gramsci, again, security analyst. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be back with Mark on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays, when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and our guest, Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. Mark, thank you again for being with us. We're talking about Armenia, Azerbaijan, the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. Towards the tail end of that segment, we were talking pretty extensively about the state of turmoil that Armenia's political system, specifically its prime minister, Nikol Pashinyan, both created and is now having to live with and might soon be stepping down from. That's certainly not going to solve those problems. I'm curious, looking at this on the first hand, historically from his perspective, just looking back briefly, why do you think he did this? This seems to have been, in retrospect, clearly a mistake. Now, admittedly, hindsight is often closer to 2020 than foresight, but nevertheless, that seems to have been predictable. Azerbaijan, wealthier, has been building up its military, and has for a while now had this sort of informal alliance with Turkey. So on the one hand, why did he do this? And on the other hand, where do you see the Armenian people going? Not Pashinyan, not Sarkisian, the president, but where do you see the Armenian people wanting to go? What kind of politicians do you think they're going to put into place? And what perspective do you think those politicians are going to have on this conflict and on this ceasefire? Mark?
Yeah, it is. Really, I have not met anyone who has really understood Pashinyan's thought process during all of this, because if anyone had a mandate to cut a land for peace deal, as you discussed before with Azerbaijan, the way he was swept to power, it was assumed that Pashinyan did. It was assumed by many that he would, but he did exactly the opposite and swung this harsh nationalist tone, even at odds with many of his own supporters. Perhaps he felt that despite Russian statements to the contrary for decades now, that Russia would step in to protect Armenian occupied territories in Azerbaijan. And Russia had always made clear that one, they believe that those 7 occupied territories need to be handed back eventually, and that the Collective Security Treaty Organization arrangement, a mutual defense pact that they had with Armenia did not include Russian boys and girls in uniform dying to protect it. Essentially Armenian conquests in what was internationally recognized Azerbaijani territory. This despite the fact that Pashinyan, basically, moved the country or started to try to move the country away from Russia. Did he think that Russia would have no choice but to step in? Of course, from the Russian side during all of this, there was never even the suggestion that thought even occurred to them that they would. They made it clear that only if Azerbaijan attacked Armenia proper would their defense treaty be activated. In their view, it never was, and they never did. And there's still quite a bit of resentment in Armenia. Many hoped that it would step in. But right now, they also know that those Russian peacekeepers now, with a 5-year agreement to have them on the ground, that what remains of Nagorno-Karabakh, the majority of it, depends, in ethnic Armenian hands, depends entirely on the presence of those Russian peacekeepers. And Russia comes out of this very, very well, having not chosen not to estrange either Armenia or Azerbaijan, and now having peacekeeping troops in both countries gives them a high degree of leverage over them. I would expect that Armenia will eventually get rid of Pashinyan, whether it has to wait till the next election or beforehand, and that Armenians, however they may feel, will face the reality that, well, obviously the West is not going to come running to their aid, and these pro-Western politicians trying to steer this landlocked country surrounded by enemies, Turkey on one side and Azerbaijan the other, and uncooperative Georgia to the north, and just a tiny sliver of territory with a nominally friendly Iran to the south, that they really have no choice. And of course, their largest trading partner is Russia. They have no choice to be but on good terms in Russia, and the existence of Nagorno-Karabakh in ethnic Armenian hands depends on it. And further, there's a big question now of cultural heritage, because there's a lot of ethnic Armenian churches that fall within Azerbaijani territory now. They go back thousands of years. And a number of the high-profile ones, Russian peacekeepers have already been deployed to with Azerbaijani government approval to protect those sites from any type of retribution, because of course when Armenia took territory from Azerbaijan almost 3 decades ago, there was a fair amount of damage, not only done to houses and infrastructure, but to mosques in the territory as well, with quite infamously one of them having been turned into a cowshed, which was viewed as of course a huge escalatory inflammation
insults, basically,
by the Azerbaijan. Yes. I mean, a blasphemy even.
Mark, what was Pashinyan thinking? What was he thinking? And let me explain what I mean by this. Azerbaijan, like we mentioned before, there was an alliance with Turkey, an enemy of Armenia for obvious reasons, just for historical sake. You had a situation where Azerbaijan clearly was more dominant in regards to the money that it was bringing in from oil. That oil money was being used to buy weapons. And I would imagine if there was any basic level of intelligence, meaning from the standpoint of Armenia keeping track of a fragile situation, because this wasn't like a solved conflict. This was basically a conflict where both of these guys were each other with guns pointed. And so when one side seemingly started to get more and more guns, and bigger guns, and those guns are bigger than your guns, then it seems like somebody in the military will have the conversation of like, look, if this pops off, we can't win this. Make a deal. Was that process never there? I mean, that just seems, it seems bizarre that they would let it get to a military conflict that they couldn't win.
Yeah, that seems to exactly have happened. And we can only assume that Pashinyan, having no previous experience in government and with no military background, and himself, unlike the former cadre, which was often known as the Karabakh clique, the former president and his assistant, they were actually involved in the last Karabakh war. They knew the stakes. Pashinyan knew none of that. And, he brought in a whole lot of people without military experience to run the civilian side of the military. And on just 4 days into the conflict, this is coming from the Armenian chief of the general staff, their head of the military. He's now saying that just 4 days into the conflict, he came to Pashinyan and said, hey, look, we're seriously outmatched here. And the advantages that we held in terrain, the defending mountainous terrain, aren't enough. We will lose catastrophically you need to cut a peace deal in 2 to 3 days, I can't be responsible for what happens after that. We cannot hold against this and by Azerbaijan supported by Turkey, and yet Pashinyan did nothing to cut a deal, and it turned deals down and continued, moreover, to lie to the Armenian people. Up until the very end, his government was presenting a very rosy perspective, saying that all of the Azerbaijani claims about success and battlefield dominance were propaganda, were lies, and actually, of course, what his government was saying was propaganda and lies and covering up the complete dominance militarily of Azerbaijan during this conflict. So I can only assume that it is his complete inability to comprehend the military matters as they were.
I wonder if, given the opportunity, is this a situation where Russia let them hang on the vine in order to get across need? Meaning, you made the point that Pashinyan tried to take the country further and closer to the West. And did he believe in some weird way that the West was somehow going to give him some kind of benefit or bonus that Russia wasn't? And in an odd way, Russia not getting overtly involved and keeping this kind of balance is beautiful politics, if we're being honest. This dance between the raindrops of not alienating Azerbaijan or Armenia, despite these two being in conflict, that is not an easy position to take, and they were able to take it. So do you think this is one of those things of kind of making the point of you were willing to move to the West, and the West was not going to help you in this situation? Almost like...
Yeah,
go ahead, please.
Yeah. If Pashinyan thought that the West was going to come militarily to his aid, or even politically with sanctions or something that would have some type of deterrence value against Azerbaijan recovering their own internationally recognized territory from Armenia, well, he was completely naive then, because of course, the West barely noticed the conflict, much less took any political or military action to protect the government, in Armenia, or the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. And it is widely viewed that Russia, although Russia always made it clear that they would not militarily step in, there is more that Russia could have done. They could have politically sided greater with Armenia. They could have leveled sanctions against Azerbaijan. Russia, first of all, didn't do nothing. They were delivering military flights to Armenia. Azerbaijan protested about that. They had to fly over the Caspian and down through Iran, which allowed them to pass through its territory to get into that small border with Armenia, because Georgia would not allow Russia to send military aid to Armenia over its territory. That was the only way for Russia to get military flights there. Now, Russia does have a military base still in Armenia against the border with Turkey. It's viewed as a deterrence against Turkey. But Russia did a little bit, but they could have done much more. And it is viewed that, yes, this was a lesson that Moscow, a hard lesson that Moscow has taught Armenia, that the West will not save you. We are the only ones who guarantee the basically the existence of Armenia, much less Nagorno-Karabakh, surrounded by enemies.
Absolutely fascinating politics. Mark, thank you for coming on. Mark is an international relations and security analyst, and you can follow him on Twitter at MarkSoblota1 and find him on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci. Always love that name. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, maps tracking new coronavirus infections in the continental United States were bathed in a sea of red on Friday morning, with every state showing the virus spreading with worrying speed. More than 250,000 people have died in the United States, a number that grew by 1,962 on Thursday. The COVID Tracking Project reported that more than 80,000 people were in the hospital, the highest number since the pandemic began. And Maryland, Montgomery County's health officer on Thursday even urged private school heads to discontinue in-person instruction as COVID-19 cases surge in the area. In a letter, Dr. Travis Gales wrote that he and the county leaders, quote, strongly encourage all schools in Montgomery County to reassess continued in-person instruction and strongly consider a return to full virtual instruction, unquote, until the county's case rate per 100,000 resident drops. The letter does not mandate the schools comply with Gale's requests. Every school was asked to notify the Department of Health and Human Services by December 4th whether it plans to move all virtual model or continuing offering in-person instruction. The county's test positivity rate has steadily increased over the past month, now at 5.1%. The 7-day average of cases per 100,000 was 29.2 on Thursday, the highest level since the pandemic began. Gales asked schools to remain in all virtual model until the rate drops to below 15 cases per 100,000 people. We have a clip that I played on the last one dealing with the government's response, with basically the COVID task force finally meeting after apparently months of inaction. And listen to what happens at the very end where these guys refuse to take questions. I'm not sure if we have the clip. Do we have the clip available that we can play?
Yes.
Excellent. Yes. Let's play the clip.
Thank you. You are going to take questions, aren't you? Are you not going to take? Are you really not going to take questions? All of you need to answer this.
Why is the federal government?
What is going on? And you're not working with the transition. You're all part of not recognizing democracy. You're all undermining the democratic election. Every one of you.
Why is the federal
government? And you
government
won't work with the transition.
That chaos erupted because the COVID task force went for a meeting and would not accept questions afterwards. Meaning, me telling you all of this, all of these people dying, up to nearly 2,000 cases, and that number is steadily going up. And there is no hand on the controls in regards to try to mitigate this. The president's eye is trying to stay in office. With this kind of weird thing of he's trying to stay in office for what? You have 2,000 people dropping like flies per day. Why are you trying to get back in office? I mean, it's astonishing. Basically, that end meeting, they refused to answer any questions at all while they continued to try to foment these lawsuits. It's astonishing. Mexico has recorded more than 100,000 deaths from COVID-19, the fourth country to pass the milestone. Government officials have acknowledged that the true toll from the pandemic is likely higher. Only the United States, Brazil, and India have recorded more deaths than Mexico, which has a population of roughly 125 million. Its mortality rate, 9.8%, is one of the highest in the world. Wow, that's aggravating. You have no idea how aggravating that is. Digital culture and news company BuzzFeed agreed to buy HuffPost from Verizon Media, the company announced Thursday, a move that combines two of the internet's largest consumer media properties. Verizon will also make an investment and become a minority shareholder in BuzzFeed, and the deal will see the two companies partner on shopping experiences for consumers, content syndication across other platforms, and ad products. BuzzFeed paid for HuffPost with company shares, the value of which is not disclosed. The merger follows other similar partnerships in the media industry as companies such as Vice Media, which acquired Refinery 29 in a $400 million deal, and Vox Media, which required New York media, looks to grow and evolve in the changing digital landscape. Verizon Media acquired HuffPost when it bought AOL for a reported $4.4 billion in 2015. NBC Universal and parent company of NBC News is an investor in BuzzFeed. Presser yesterday from Donald Trump's legal team included Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, in which Giuliani laid out a wide variety of anecdotal cases for voter fraud, and Powell blamed international leftists, actually she used the term communists, for hacking onto voting machines. They blamed New York authorities investigated the Trump Organization, which have expanded their inquiries to include tax write-off involving millions of dollars in consulting fees. And investigators with the Manhattan District Attorney Office, which is conducting a broad criminal investigation, and the New York Attorney General Office, which has a civil inquiry underway, have subpoenaed the Trump Organization seeking records relating to consultation fees. The subpoenas were in response to the New York Times investigation into President Donald Trump's tax returns that first disclosed that he took $26 million in write-offs that came from fees to pay consultants, including an apparent $747,000 fee that the Times matched a payment disclosed by Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump. The New York Times first reported the subpoenas had been sent. There is no suggestion that Ivanka Trump accounted for the payments improperly. Representatives for the Manhattan District Attorney, New York Attorney General, and Trump Organization declined to comment. Ivanka Trump reacted to the Times story Thursday evening, tweeting, quote, "This is harassment pure and simple. This inquiry by New York Democrats is 100% motivated by politics, publicity, and rage. They know very well that there is nothing there and that there is no tax benefit whatsoever. These politicians are simply ruthless." Simply ruthless. Azerbaijan forces have entered the district bordering Nagorno-Karabakh as it begins retaking territory held nearly 30 years by the Armenian-backed government as part of the Russian-brokered peace deal. Videos show troops and armored vehicles moving into the district of Agdam, which Armenia conceded in its armistice just days after columns of its soldiers and tanks rolled out of the territory. Armenia will also hand over the Kaljar district, wedged between Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia on November 25th, and the Lachian district by December 1st. On Thursday, Armenian residents of Agdan hurriedly picked pomegranates and perimans from trees surrounding their homes and packed vans with furniture before fleeing ahead of the official deadline to cede the mountainous province. Tens of thousands of Azerbaijanis or Azeris are expected to return to the region. On Friday, Azerbaijan quickly organized prayers at local mosques to signal the return of the city to control of the mostly Muslim nation. Political tensions have remained high in Armenia, where the truce was viewed by many as capitulation by the government and the Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan. On Friday, several Armenian news sources reported that the Ministers of Defense, David Tonyan, had tendered his resignation in what, if confirmed, will be another exit of a high-ranking official from his cabinet. The country's foreign minister resigned earlier this week, and its president, Armen Sarkisyan, had called for Pashinyan to step down and allow snap elections to lead the country out of the crisis. Well, Burundi is no longer welcoming the United Nations Special Envoy to East African nation, asserting that peace has been achieved after a deadly political crisis. In a letter sent to the UN Secretary General and seen by the Associated Press, Burundi's foreign minister said the office had no reason to be there. It will close by the end of the year. Quote, "After a successful electoral process, which led to historic political transition, peaceful and exemplary in Africa, the government of Burundi finds that a UN presence with a political character is no longer relevant," unquote. Albert Shinjiro wrote. He asserted that the office, quote, "kept Burundi in a psychosis of artificial crisis cleverly maintained by foreign actors," unquote. Burundi has achieved peace, security, and stability, he asserted. A source at the office of the Special Envoy to Burundi confirmed the letter. The office opened in 2016 in the wake of deadly political unrest. around former President Pierre Nkurunziza's ultimate successful decision to pursue another term. The office had a mandate to help Burundi's government engage in dialogue with its opponents and its critics. Pierre died earlier this year, shortly after the election he did not contest, and current President Ivistardi, I cannot pronounce that last name, so I'm just going to go with Ivistardi, has spoken of moving on from the past. But human rights groups and other watchdogs have warned they see little change from the repressive ways of the previous administration. Shane, this is kind of interesting. So you basically have a political conflict, you have UN peacekeepers, and you have people on the ground basically saying, look, at this point, the peacekeepers are interrupting the actual process of peace. Very fascinating. It's kind of like North Korea and South Korea. There were elements where it seems like North Korea and South Korea was trying to reunify. And it almost felt like if you left them to their own devices, means would take place over the years that would allow these two countries to come to some level of peace. And it honestly did seem like U.S. interaction between those two things was making that process that much more difficult or worse. Burundi, whether you accept their argument or not, is basically saying that the peacekeepers are making this situation difficult, if not impossible, to actually have peace. What do you think about that? I mean, is there a legitimacy to that, right? I mean, I can kind of see that. If you have an edifice that's in place that is looking at you entirely through the lens of what you were, then you can kind of have that in place. Like if somebody was an alcoholic, and at every scenario you keep bringing up the fact the person was an alcoholic, that type of stuff. But again, I mean, the UN may have a point that, look, not much has changed in this, and these guys just want us to leave. Very interesting, the politics of this.
It is. Yeah, it is very interesting. I mean, I think that broadly, that's the take that I would have. What you were just saying, too, is they don't need them anymore. I'm just going to highlight, though, this phrase. This is a particularly luminous phrase. Kept Burundi in a psychosis of artificial crisis, cleverly maintained by foreign actors, and quote unquote. You're talking about the political character of the UN envoy. I'm curious what that political character was. There's not enough in this, not enough to go on in this headline to determine exactly what political influence the UN was having through that envoy on Burundi's state, but clearly it was becoming at least by their side unwelcome. So just interesting to note. That's the UN is a political body, and not just in the sense that it operates on politics. It also has its own politics, and it brings those to bear wherever it goes. And so I'm curious what impact it was having.
Yeah, it's not an inert body. It's not like water. You know what I mean? It's not neutral in this sense. There's another story I wanted to get to because I thought was fascinating. This is the United States can kill its own citizens without review when state secrets are involved, the Department of Justice lawyer argues. Now, this is basically, I'll just read it. The government's brief in a case supplies details of the lawsuit. The plaintiff, Bial Abdul Karim, is a U.S. citizen who works as a journalist in Syria for the on-the-ground network news channel, which provides access to views of rebel fighters. The militaries were linked to al-Qaeda, according to the courthouse services. Karim alleges that he was narrowly missed by 5 military strikes that he thinks were carried out by the United States military as a result of its inclusion on a kill list. He suggests that he was put on that list because of metadata from electronic devices that doesn't meet the guidelines for inclusion. Now, this is an article called the ABBA Journal. Now, the interesting thing about this, and the reason why I was enamored by this, is because this happened once before, whether people realize it or not. Under the Obama administration, Obama basically made the argument that we can kill American citizens, and this does not require due process of law, meaning we don't need to go through the court system for this. And Obama did. He killed Alawaki, an American citizen. Again, no due process of law. He killed his kid. I think it was a 16-year-old, and he ends up killing the daughter, if I'm not mistaken, along with the cousin. When pushed on this, Gibbs, one of the people associated with Obama, made the point that he should have had a different dad. You should have had a different dad. If you had a different dad, you wouldn't be dead right now. Look, the argument that these guys are making, the judge is incredulous about this argument because it's an undermining of judicial powers. By the same token, The Obama administration already did it, and there were no consequences for the Obama administration doing it. And I remember when this took place, and I'm sitting there like, whoa, what do you mean due process doesn't require the judicial branch? And yet, that was the argument that was pushed. Nobody pushed back on the argument because it was Obama. And now you have the Justice Department making this argument again in the court of law. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I just wanted to nail that down, that this wasn't just the Trump administration. This argument was made in the Obama administration. Obama carried it out, and there were no consequences for him killing the American citizen and his kid. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. This is Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in DC. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, definitely give us a like and definitely share this audio or video. And you can also reach us in a chat, a tweet, or of course by phone at 202-521-1320. But joining us right now, Theodros, and I'm having a little bit of difficulty with the last name. How do you pronounce your last name? Is it Fikre?
So long story. It's Fikre Mariam. The full name is Fikre Mariam, but when I came to America, it just got dropped to Fikre. But it's Fikre Mariam.
Interesting.
And it's my dad's first name. So in Ethiopia, we take
that's fascinating.
First name and our last.
Okay. Yeah. So let's Theodros Fikrama.
Fikre Mariam.
Fikre Mariam. Okay, excellent. Yeah.
Theodros. We just call me I used to tell the fellas back in the day, just call me Teddy.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay. Teddy. But the co-founder and former editor of the GeonJournal.com. Okay, Theodros, I haven't seen you in a while. I remember your work prior, and I used to read your work in the Gideon Journal once before, and I think we've met once before when you were on Fault Lines. So it's great to see you again, or at the very least hear from you again. We were having a conversation about Ethiopia, and it was this back and forth between the Tigray region and basically the Ethiopian government, Abiy Ahmed. Ahmed, Nobel Peace Prize, basically gets in office and ends up in a conflict with the Tigray region, basically a heavily militarized region that at one point was, I guess, the power center of Ethiopia, or the area that had the power center of Ethiopia. What is the latest in this? Can you give us a heads up about what peace is going to be in regards to, what is peace going to be like in that region, or if there will be peace in that region? Even the conflict in and of itself in regards to how the government forces are going against the Tigray region. Can you explain why this conflict is taking place and give us kind of an overview of the latest?
So, in the Fargo War, there's no clear-cut answer to anything, right? I mean, these things, the way that's being presented right now is something that's almost happening in a vacuum, and it's not. This is something that's been developing over the past really 27 years, but even before that, where there's been conflicts between the various ethnicities that only festered and became even more, more dominant due to the previous regime. They call them the TPLF, that ruled with an iron fist for 27 years. So much so that they pretty much oppressed anyone that was not from their own specific ethnic group. And even that I had to revisit because a lot of Tigrayans suffered greatly under the rule of the TPLF. But, in Africa, the way that African countries have been kept subdued for a long time is because tribalism has been instigated. And we're taught to fight each other instead of realizing that we're all in this together. So this has been something that's been going on for a very long time. Specifically to this event, what happened, ironically on November 3rd during the U.S. elections, the TPLF forces, by their own admittance, attacked the Ethiopian national military, and that sparked, the current conflict. There's a lot of media disinformation where they try to, put a moral equivalency between the two, or they try to say that. And by the way, I'm not a cheerleader of Abiy Ahmed. I've been critical of him in the past, but at certain times you have to kind of, call a spade when it comes to these things. So the TPLF was clearly the party that started this, that initiated this. Once they came out of power in 2018, they basically, ran off to Tigray and fortified themselves, started stockpiling weapons, and they're just kind of bidding their time before they did what they did about 2 weeks ago. For the fact that they're kind of almost a parity between the national military and the militia tells you a lot about how much weaponry and battle knowledge that they've retained over 27 years of ruling Ethiopia. This has a lot of, consequences, not only to Ethiopia, but to the region as a whole. If this widens into a regional war, then the implications are dire in terms of how many Ethiopians could be displaced and how much this could roll over into Eritrea, Sudan, and it could engulf the whole region. And you could just imagine how many millions, if not tens of millions of people are going to end up suffering because of it.
Tedros, thank you again for being with us. Shane here. A couple of quick questions here that kind of fit together. What's the balance of power right now, looking at it from the outside, between the TPLF and Abiy Ahmed's government? And then outside, sort of internationally, are there anybody who would step in? Is this the kind of thing where you see the UN potentially stepping in at a certain point? If so, what would that look like from your perspective, Tedros?
Well, I hope that I don't want to sound like I'm cheerleading for war, right? Because I've been anti-war for a very long time. I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a pacifist, because if somebody comes after me, I'm not going to just turn the other cheek and let them stab me in the back. But I don't believe in wars. That being said, I think the very worst thing that could happen in this case is something that's not a decisive outcome, because then that creates a perpetual state of conflict. And like I said, if this happened in America, where a bunch of fringe elements attacked the national government, nobody would expect the U.S. government not to respond, with its full force and might. When radicals end up, attacking French citizens, and chopping off heads, then nobody says, "Hey, negotiate with them." And so, and I know that this is going to rub a lot of Tigrayans the wrong way, and I want to kind of say from the outset that, whatever exceptions that I take towards the TPLF and the ruthless ways that they have ruled Ethiopia for nearly 3 decades, I don't conflate that with Tigrayans. Like I said, Tigrayans suffered greatly during the same time. And in fact, this is ironic that I'm actually writing an article at this exact moment called, and I hate to plug myself in the middle of this conversation, but it's titled "The Mindless Menace of Travelism," and it just talks. It's the original person that gave that speech was Robert F. Kennedy, and his speech was "The Mindless Menace of Violence." But we human beings, we're so conditioned to view our identities through constructs that we forget about the commonalities that we have. I interviewed Marcia Dyson a long time ago. She said something that really stood out, which is the commonality of pains. There's a commonality of pains, whether you're quote unquote black or white, or, all these labels that we've been conditioned to accept. They make us see only our pains, only our struggles. But if you look at, if you step back from the ego and look at actually, what are the sources of injustice? What are the sources of inequality? It goes beyond just the tribes that we belong to, And unfortunately, when I speak against the TPLF, there's a lot of Tigrayans that identify with the TPLF, It's kind of like the same way when there's a conflict between the Ethiopian National Government and TPLF, Tigrayans, a lot of them flock to the TPLF the same way that when America was attacked, people that used to hate Bush, all of a sudden he had 90% approval rating because they felt like they were being attacked. So these dynamics are very complex. But like I said, what I hope and pray for is a decisive outcome. If not, if this thing continues to fester, then you're talking about, not only a year or two, but decades of perpetual instability that can lead to Ethiopia becoming the next Yugoslavia and breaking up along ethnic lines. And again, that would have devastating consequences for the entire region.
This is a fascinating conflict, honestly. When I was in Kenya, one of the things that is, as an African American, going to Africa, and you go somewhere like Kenya, and all of the pictures, all of the images, the people who are in parliament, all of them are black. It is a weird experience. And, I sat there watching Kenyan parliament. Many of them speak English. And so you can definitely understand what's going on. And it's such a heady experience to be an American going into a place where you're not really a minority from the standpoint of race. In fact, everybody looks like you. But then there's a tribal issue. And it's like this breakdown based on tribes. And it's like, you're like, but all of you are black. It's like all of you it's like you're looking for something to be angry about. It's so wild. And it makes it very clear that whether it's race, whether it's tribe, whether it's class, one person can have a gray spot on their hair and a lot of people have it. And all of a sudden you'll get this kind of breakdown between the people with gray spots or not, people with nipples or not. Like, it seems like there's always something that people find to create a distinction and to fight over. It's really bizarre. Let me ask, what is the ultimate point of this? Just from the standpoint of the Tigray issue, what is their goal? I mean, is the goal to break up the country? Is the goal to take power again? What is the ultimate objective?
So I must make a distinction between what is the goal of the TPLF versus what is the goal of the Tigrayans as a whole, right? The goal of the TPLF is obvious, as far as I'm concerned. It's primacy. They were in charge for 27 years. They ruled with an iron fist, and they do not like not being at the head of the table. So, by way of the gun, they want to achieve a political objective. That is not necessarily the case for Tigrayans as a whole. A lot of Tigrayans, as is the case for a lot of Ethiopians, because when it comes to, poverty, or when it comes to lack of opportunities, these things are not contained or constrained by what tribal ethnicity you're from. But as have Oromos felt, or as have Somalis felt in Ethiopia, or as have Amaras felt, a lot of Tigrayans felt marginalized. But because of identity politics, I call it tribal hustle now, because identity politics, the conservatives have hijacked that to make it seem like only quote unquote minorities do that. But these tribal hustlers condition people to say, hey, the person that is doing this to you is somebody else from another tribe that is also suffering, but forget they're suffering. They're your problem. So a lot of Tigrayans have been in fact marginalized in the past, and so they have grievances, and you can say justified grievances, just like how a lot of Oromos have justified grievances, a lot of Amaras have justified grievances.
Teddy, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt because we're coming to the end of the break,
Sure.
but we're going to have to bring you back. In fact, I think we're going to bring you back next week so we can get into a larger, full-throated conversation because I feel like 20 questions behind the question that I just asked.
Same. Absolutely.
Right.
This would be great.
So let's do this. Let's take a break and let's go into the next guest. But Theodore's Fikera. In fact, I'm going to let you pronounce your last name because I want people to be able to find you, which is why I want to get it not necessarily just saying Teddy. So please give your full name.
So it's Theodoros Fikramariam. On Twitter, it's Theodoros, TEODROSC FIKRE. That's my handle. And also you can find me at the Gion Journal. That's GHION journal.com. And I write on a frequent basis there. So thank you, Shane. And
absolutely.
And thank you for having me on the show. And I look forward to our conversations again.
No, man, we will see you next week. Absolutely. Theodore Fikre, co-founder and former editor of theunionjournal.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And our guest for this segment and the next, Daniel Lazar. He is an independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. And he has written a number of books, including From Moses to ISIS, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. Daniel, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. All right. We've got a potential constitutional crisis. We decided to have a conversation with you about it. Trump contesting the election mightily. I'll just start it off like this. We can get into the constitutionality of this. Why do you think Trump's doing this? Do you think he's genuinely fighting for re-election? Do you think there's something else at play? Just to sort of set the table here, Daniel.
Well, I think that he's definitely fighting for a second term. I mean, I think he thinks he can pull it off. And I'm not entirely sure he can't.
And then just going into the constitutionality of it, where do you think this is going to go? Do you think this is going to have any kind of long-term repercussions? And if so, what would they be on America's legal basis, on the Constitution itself, on the judiciary, undoubtedly on future elections, potentially, if he manages to pull this off? And frankly, we can also start with square one. Do you think it's going to work, Daniel?
Do I think it's going to work? I think it's a long shot, to say the least. I think if it does work, it'll be a recipe for both dictatorship and civil war. Americans have had two elections stolen from them in the last 20 years. If a third one happens, there will be an outcry to end all outcries. People will be furious. They will take to the streets in unprecedented numbers. It's impossible to know what will happen. And Trump will have no choice but to crack down harshly. Now, but that is said, but let me just emphasize, that is given this longest of long shots succeeding. So I don't know what's going to happen.
I felt the same way, Daniel. that the only way this could turn out, meaning from the standpoint of Trump keeping or taking power, is a civil war. I don't know how it doesn't. I mean, ultimately, you end up with a situation where the police force has to make a determination, the military has to make a determination, and all of these people basically break down on lines of, do we support it or don't we support it? And I agree, that's a recipe for disaster. What do you think this is going to go? I mean, do you think that basically the president is just going to not concede and he's going to be escorted out of office? I mean, this is assuming that all of this fails. I don't believe this succeeds. It seems that too many people are against Trump. Even people who are in his own party seem to be against Trump, despite the theatrics of pretending like, okay, we're going to give him a little bit of leeway. What do you think this ends up with? I mean, if the president doesn't concede, is the president just escorted out of the White House? How does this ultimately work?
Well, first of all, merely the fact that it's gone this far shows how utterly enfeebled the system has become, and how it really is sliding into a disaster. And whether the disaster happens this time or next time is unclear, but clearly that the breakdown has gone much farther than anyone would have thought possible a few months ago. So we have a 230-year-old system that is in need of a total overhaul, a total democratic overhaul, but the mechanism does not provide the tools to achieve that. So therefore, we are stuck with a late 18th century frame of government, which is completely unsuited to the needs of modern society and is breaking down under its own weight. Now, as to where this ends up, I just can't foresee. I mean, if Donald Trump is still in the Oval Office as of 11:59 a.m. on January 20th, and he shows no signs of leaving, what will happen? Will they send in the Secret Service? Will the Air Force strafe the West Wing of the White House? I have no idea. But just as I said before, the fact that it has gotten that far is just an incredible indictment of this completely archaic, over-the-hill constitutional system.
So let me throw this in here. What if there actually is voter fraud? What if there is rampant enough voter fraud? What if there was some sort of inside job, with the software services used to collate data here? What if there were, instructions handed down, et cetera? What if? Daniel, what's your take?
Well, I mean, if Rudy Giuliani can prove that to the satisfaction of the Supreme Court, then we're in different territory. But so far, none of the evidence he's put forward has been really very impressive. I mean, we'd have to examine it more fully, and I guess keep an open mind. I mean, give him his day in court. But certainly, like the idea that somehow Chavez and Maduro are responsible for this commie hack of the U.S. electoral system, that's not a very persuasive argument in my book. In fact, it's counter-persuasive.
Nor in mine, just to be clear.
No, go ahead, Shade. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying not in mine either. Yeah, that one came out of left field, and again, reviving Hugo Chavez as a boogeyman in U.S. politics is that's sad. It's not good to see, and of course, setting us up for more interventionism in Latin America, in South America, and Central America.
Won his elections. Like that was the other weirdness to this. As I was watching that, there was a point where Bush was involved. I believe it was Bush in a coup in regards to Venezuela. Hugo Chavez talked about basically about to be killed, where people fled the streets. Meaning he was that popular where people were flooding the streets in order to prevent the coup from taking place. But they're acting as if he wasn't popular enough to get elected. I mean, this is nonsense, right? I mean, these guys are basically pushing this particular narrative. Right now, yesterday, they were in Pennsylvania court trying to get the judge to overturn the Pennsylvania election. It's just mind-blowing. Daniel, what should they do, right? I mean, you're saying the system is archaic. You're saying the system is kind of rickety and so forth. Is it the system itself, or is the issue the logic by which the system operates? Or is there something deeper in the consciousness of the person? Meaning, even if we had this particular political system, this political system could work under some other guise. Or no, it's the system itself that basically creates the intransigence in the way it operates.
Well, first of all, it's a 230-year-old system, and the way it's kept itself in place is through kind of institutional intransigence. The Constitution is the great immovable, and there's no way it can be changed except according to its own terms, via Article 5, the amending clause. And the amending clause is totally broken down. There hasn't been a new constitutional amendment in half a century. The amending clause allows tiny minorities to veto any constitutional change. So we're stuck with a plan of government which dates from the late 18th century and is growing more rigid and change-averse the older it gets. And that's a recipe for disaster. And the disaster is now upon us. Now, there are mechanisms. There are constitutional mechanisms that we could create to prevent this kind of situation from happening. But we can't create them because the founders didn't leave us the tools. So America is caught in a perfect catch-22. I mean, people know what needs to be done, but they also know they can't do it because the whole structure will not allow them to do it. It's amazing.
So here's the thing. I'm in a weird position because I actually kind of agree in some ways, but then I also have these concerns, and I'm sure you've heard many times over, and I kind of want to hear you address them. I agree. It's like there's this tradition in Judaism where you dance with the Torah. I think it's Simchat Torah. You dance with the Torah. You dance with this symbolic document that undergirds your whole religion, but you're supposed to have a relationship with. It's supposed to be a sort of a dynamic relationship, and in some sense, it reduces the formality. It doesn't necessarily reduce your reverence, but it brings you into a relationship. Anyway, we might consider doing something similar with the Constitution. You might have some, not just reading it, not just relating to it in that sense, but, occasionally reflecting on it and, yes, even changing it, not just amending it. I hear you. On the other hand, isn't the Constitution, isn't it by design supposed to represent a bulwark against eroding our rights? And in other words, and there's this argument, if you're trying to change the Constitution to improve the fate of Americans, aren't you simultaneously opening up this process by which tyrannical powers can change the Constitution to erode the rights of Americans, to decrease our quality of life, et cetera? I'm just curious about broadly that take on your argument. What do you think about that, Daniel?
Well, yes. I mean, those concerns are often made, but what greater erosion of our rights can there be if there's dictatorship and civil war? In other words, the Constitution is sowing the seeds of its own destruction. You can't have a permanent form of government that is unchanging over the centuries. And the more you try, the more self-defeating the effort will get. So yeah, opening up the Constitution would be very dangerous. But there are times when you've got to court danger in the hope of something better coming out of it, and stasis will only lead to catastrophe, and that's exactly what we're seeing now. We're seeing a 230-year-old system collapse before our very eyes, and if we're talking here about what happens at noon on January 20th, as Trump refuses to leave. The very fact that we have no clear mechanism to deal with that situation shows what dangerous strait this country is in.
Well, here's the other side of it, though. We're pretty close to a break, so I'll try to keep my end of this short. But do you really trust Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and soon enough Joe Biden to preside over that process? I get what you're saying broadly. I don't like stasis or sclerosis. I don't like any of that stuff either. But the political system just seems to be getting worse. Do you really trust the current generation of leadership to successfully manage that transition, Daniel?
No, I don't. The current generation of leadership, Schumer, Pelosi, et cetera, are products of the same decrepit system. We've got to step outside the constitutional framework and create a new framework, not under the amending clause, but under the preamble, which gives we the people total power to change our society as we wish in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The preamble gives the people total sweep to do whatever they want to do.
I see. So you're talking. Okay, this is setting us up for another interesting conversation on the other side of this break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and we are joined by Daniel Lazar, He is an independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, author of a number of books. And real quick, if you want to check him out on Twitter, twitter.com/DHLAZARE. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory, or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us for a radically interesting conversation is Daniel Lazare, independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He's written a number of books, including From Moses to ISIS, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. Daniel, you said something that was pretty hair on fire before we closed out that statement. Basically, it sounds like you're calling for a revolution. In fact, to smash the Constitution in the way that it sounds like you're saying to smash the Constitution is basically what happens on day 2 of the revolution. And do you believe that revolution, because we're not talking about Pelosi opening the documents, we're talking about going back to basics with getting rid of this other stuff. I would make the argument that the issue is not the Constitution. The issue is not even the government structure in and of itself. It's the mindset. You can have any government structure you want that can fall into disrepute if it allows people to somehow advantage themselves, or if the incentives built into it push them to act in a certain direction, whether that's with America or whether that's with the UK and Parliament. I mean, ultimately, this Constitution does allow itself to be remade. The problem is that the political system has become so, ossified and so corrupt and rusted that ability to get anything done in regards to changing the document itself has frayed. So it's not, I guess my argument is, it's not an issue where we're saying the issue is the document. The issue, to some degree, are the people and incentives that are built into this political process. Because to be honest, you could have a political system that is radically different, even under this exact same Constitution. Is that fair?
Well, it's an illogical argument, because if what you're saying is true, that if it's the people, not the system, then it wouldn't matter if we had a democracy, a monarchy, etc. The whole American Revolution would have been pointless, because you just may as well stick with George III, because maybe the next king who came along would be a better guy. So all we have to do is be patient and hope that somebody smarter takes the throne in London. Now, but that's obviously absurd. And political structure determines politics, and it determines the personalities who rise in politics. Now we have a two-party system, which is the oldest in the world. I mean, poll after poll shows that Americans yearn to breathe free with a third party, but the system won't allow them to have a third party. There hasn't been a successful third party since the Republicans in 1856. This is the most ossified political system on the face of the earth. It reminds me of the Chinese Empire prior to 1912, or Tsarist Russia. The idea of basic structural change has been completely forgotten. And even though the preamble says that we, the people, ordain and establish constitutions in order to improve our own well-being, I mean, that idea has fallen into disuse.
I guess that's my point, though. I guess that's my point. It's there. It's not a situation. I'm not arguing that we should go back to kings and queens or monarchies. That's not my argument. My argument is that the Constitution in and of itself allows itself to be remade, which is flat fact true. Whether the people and the public itself gets into their head in this kind of headspace that they don't want to do it or that they can't do it, that's a whole separate conversation. You just so shade. You don't believe that Pelosi and these guys would do a great job of it. I don't believe either. I don't believe any of these guys would be good suitors looking out for the best interests of the American public because they don't do it now. I guess what I'm saying is the Constitution does allow itself to be remade if the public itself chooses not to do that or gets into a headspace where that no longer is on the table. That's something that we got to, not necessarily that it was already built into the bricks. Or am I wrong? I mean, is that also an absurd argument?
Yes, you're wrong. The Constitution does not allow itself to be remade. There's an amending clause in Article 5, which you probably remember. It says very clearly, in order to change so much as a comma, you need the approval of 2/3 of each house plus 3/4 of the states. That means that 13 states can veto any constitutional change. And 13 states can account for as little as 4.4% of the U.S. population. That is less than half the level it was in 1790, by the way. So essentially, Article 5 presents an insurpassable barrier to fundamental constitutional change. So the system can't be changed. America is locked in, not just now, not just for the next decade, but in perpetuity.
That's fair. You're right. No, I think you're right. I mean, as I think about it, it's like, yes, just because the technical sense is there where it could be changed. And yeah, if you have political will, you can change it. But at the end of the day, it's like a false choice, I guess you're trying to argue. That basically, yeah, you have the potential to do it, but the hurdle is so high that it makes it almost impossible for the potential to ever become acclimated. I guess I'm just trying to make the point that, but it is there. I mean, it's not a situation where it's not there. It's just difficult to overcome. Is that fair?
It's not difficult. It's impossible. I mean, listen. Like, take the Second Amendment, okay? Now, some people believe that it provides for an individual right to own guns. Some people say the opposite. But the actual reality is that no one knows because the actual text itself is simply impenetrable. No one can figure out what it says. Okay? Now, in a logical society, we would simply appoint a commission to revise the text, bring it before Congress, and have Congress clarify what the Second Amendment says. But that is impossible. Therefore, Americans are doomed to argue about the right to bear arms, in perpetuity, not just now. It's like something out of Dante's Inferno. Americans are.
Well, here's the thing. But if you had a sorry for interrupting, Daniel. If you had a set in stone interpretation of a constitution of a written body, of the written body that's supposed to undergird the United States as a whole. If you had a set in stone interpretation, isn't that introducing just another kind of stasis? Like, isn't it in the very ambiguity and interpretability of the Constitution that you find some wiggle room to adapt your country, frankly, over time, your perspectives on your country, your perspectives on where your country's coming from? Isn't that the sort of the remedy to the stasis that you're describing, Daniel?
Well, yes, but the wiggle room, but the text itself is taking revenge on the wigglers. I mean, that's what all the wars are about over the Supreme Court, a series of constitutional interpretation, and that's why the originalists are now seem to have the upper hand, because the text demands to be respected. If the text says X, Y, Z, and people interpret that to mean like ABC, the text will countermand that and will have its revenge. In other words, you're limited in how far you can deviate from the text. And liberals have taken all kinds of creative liberties with the Constitution, but there's a sense in the general polity, in the general constitutional structure, that they've gone too far, and that there has to be some kind of return to the original plain meaning. Rabbis and Catholic priests argue about this for centuries over how to interpret the Bible, and essentially we're caught in the same trap. But America can't go on this way, trying to see the problems of modern society through this incredibly this incredible 18th century lens. I mean, but
I guess another perspective on this is, what is the practical alternative? Is the practical alternative to not have a written body? Because say you were to introduce another constitution, for instance, like this Constitution 2.0. How would that differ on a fundamental level from the Constitution that we have now? Or would you simply not prefer to have another constitution? Would you prefer some other means of sort of organizing the philosophy underlying the polity?
Okay. So you have the Article 5 leaves open the possibility of a constitutional convention being formed. But the problem with the constitutional convention is that whatever the convention comes up with, it must then be approved by 2/3 of each house plus 3/4 of the states. So you're back where you started, and any substantial change, especially one which in any way reduces the special privileges to small states like the Wyoming, the Dakotas, et cetera, would run into a buzzsaw of opposition. So the Constitutional Convention is no solution. So I have argued, and other legal scholars have argued as well, that the preamble is essentially a built-in alternative amending clause, because the preamble places the people above the Constitution and says the people can do whatever they want, overthrow old constitutions, create new ones in their place. And I would argue that could only be done democratically, not through a convention, but what's called a constituent assembly, in which the people would engage in majoritarian votes in determining what kind of constitution they want.
But Daniel, this is somewhat of a fig leaf, right? I mean, basically, you're saying the Constitution should be remanded, or basically should be redone. And on top of that, you're saying the preamble gives the justification for it. But the reality of it is, if you're smashing the Constitution, all of this stuff is up for grabs, right? I mean, it seems like it's just looking for an excuse to justify something, whereas the people coming together in the first place, meaning if you get to the point where the public says we need a new Constitution, then everything is all on the table at that point. And it's not being governed by the preamble. It's just being governed by people saying we need something different. Is that fair? It seems like if you're going to leave it, you're going to leave it all, not drag the preamble with you to the next iteration of America 2.0. Am I saying, I'm trying to understand the point of view, because I understand where you're coming from, but it seems that any government would need a certain degree of stick-to-itiveness in order to maintain its own integrity. By the same token, the ability to change itself when it gets too far down the line. So I understand where you're coming from. I guess it seems that using the preamble in that sense is just somewhat of a, I don't know, it's something of a governing idea behind it, when really, when you leave the Constitution, you're leaving it all. I guess I'm trying to understand it. Can you respond to that? Explain that part.
Yes. The preamble is a very, very important piece of constitutional prose. I mean, what it says, it encapsulates the idea of democracy and popular sovereignty. Government of, by, and for the people. It says, we the people ordain and establish this new constitution, and implicitly throw out the existing constitution, which is the Articles of Confederation, which are still in effect, by the way, in 1787 to 88. And we, the people, toss out old constitutions and create new constitutions in order to form a more perfect union, etc. So what that means is that we, the people, are masters of our own fate. And that is the one idea which would govern the process of reconstitution, of rebuilding, restructuring American society.
That's fascinating. Daniel, we have to break you here, but we got to get you back because this is a fascinating conversation. I love this conversation. It gets into like philosophy and law. Yeah, love it. So Daniel Lazar, independent journalist and author, best known as critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He's written a number of books, including From Moses to ISIS, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with headlines.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time for the last hour this week of the most disruptive show covering news and events in those states as well as around our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together you are listening to us, that is, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Now let's get straight into headlines here. In COVID news, maps tracking new coronavirus infections in the continental United States were bathed in a sea of red on Friday morning, with every state showing the virus spreading with worrying speed. More than 250,000 people have died in the U.S. That's a number that grew by another 1,962 on Thursday, almost 2,000 deaths for 2 days in a row here. The COVID Tracking Project reported that more than 80,000 people were in the hospital. That is the highest number since the pandemic began. In Maryland, Montgomery County's health officer on Thursday evening urged private school heads to discontinue in-person instruction as COVID-19 cases surge in the area. In a letter, Dr. Travis Gales wrote that he and county leaders strongly encourage all schools in Montgomery County to reassess continued in-person instruction and strongly consider a return to full virtual instruction, quote unquote, until the county's case rate per 100,000 residents drops. The letter does not mandate the schools comply with Gale's request. Every school was asked to notify the Department of Health and Human Services by December 4th whether it plans to move to an all-virtual model or continue offering in-person instruction. The county's test positivity rate has steadily increased over the past month and is now at 5.1%. The 7-day average of cases per 100,000 people was 29.2 on Thursday. That's the highest level since the pandemic began. Gales asked schools to remain in an all-virtual model until the rate drops to below 15 cases per 100,000 people. Mexico, meanwhile, has recorded more than 100,000 deaths from COVID-19. That's the fourth country to pass that milestone. Government officials have acknowledged that the true toll from the pandemic is likely higher. Only the U.S., Brazil, and India have recorded more deaths than Mexico, which has a population of roughly 125 million. And its mortality rate, and this is the truly scary part, is 9.8%. That's one of the highest in the world. Now, that, Jamarl, that could have to do with a couple of things. For one thing, the more tests you do, the more cases you identify, and therefore the lower that mortality rate drops. However, if you have hospitals getting oversaturated, if you don't have enough hospital beds to go around, and people aren't getting treated, and that, increases the number of people who are dying. So this is from the very earliest stages of trying to figure out the epidemiology of this disease. It's been tricky to figure out. You know what I'm talking about, right?
I get what you're saying. It becomes, when it first starts and it's like you're trying to figure out what's going on and everything else, then you're going to have a high death toll. In our case, the moment that you expand testing and everything else, then Trump would make the argument, hey, it's the testing that's the issue. Well, it's not. Because like you said, the hospital beds are overflowing. The ICUs are overflowing. And on top of that, when you have the ICUs and the hospitals overflowing from COVID, what about other stuff? It's not like people stop getting cancer or people stop getting pneumonia or these other illnesses. No, those things are compounded, meaning the cases of other diseases get pushed to the side as the hospitals have to deal with COVID. And you end up with a situation of things being undiagnosed or people dying from ailments that, all things being equal, under normal circumstances, they would have been treated for. So it compounds it, right? I mean, like Utah, rationing care. You have Texas, I think, is up to the point in some of the places where they're talking about rationing care. You have these guys talking about using stadiums for hospitals. I mean, like, the main point in the beginning, if you remember, was the flattening curve. It was understood that people were going to die. It was understood people were going to get sick. But the thought was to not have everybody slam into the hospital all at once, because the hospitals wouldn't be able to compensate for the number of people who are coming in. And it seems that that's been thrown to the wayside at this point. And, the administration, what it feels like, and I hate making this comparison, but I just finished reading the German War and Beaver's book, Berlin. At the very end, after everything was said and done, and the Russians, the Soviets, were basically coming to the bunker, and they were going to they won. Berlin was falling. Hitler basically let it burn. And his thought was, you guys failed me, so let it burn. That's what this feels like, where the Trump administration is like, we failed, we lost, and so let the public burn. But in this case, it's human beings that are basically dying from this illness. Mnuchin, right now, article just came out in the New York Times, that Mnuchin to end key federal emergency programs. The entire point is so when Biden gets in, those funds are not there for Biden to use for the COVID crisis. It's spiteful. It's spiteful. So yeah, I mean, this is horrendous.
That does sound spiteful. I hear what you're saying. I could come in and defend Trump here, but I totally get your perspective. And in some sense, if that is your perspective, if that's the optics, then that is its own kind of truth, and that's one of the more relevant political truths here. I mean, a larger part of this disease, a larger part of this problem, I think, is really the undermining of like trust, not just in institutions, but between people. The fact that, and this is, I don't want to make too much out of this, just one small side of it. If you're literally all wearing masks, you can't see each other's faces. That increases isolation. That's, in its own way, weirdly enough, not good. But just more and more, the polarization, the extent to which different people that disagree vociferously and increasingly even emotionally violently with each other about how this stuff is supposed to go. It's really undermining public trust, not just in institutions, but in each other, which is why I think we should ban argument. I think the best role for the government here should be to ban all disagreements.
It's funny. I thought you were going in a completely different direction with that. I thought you were going to say it screws with trust because people took issue with wearing a mask. Like, if I'm wearing a mask, I'm protecting you. If you're wearing a mask, you're protecting me. And if both of us are wearing masks, we're protecting each other. And if one side basically says, yeah, I don't care about the other people and whether or not they get sick. I should have my individual liberty not to wear a mask and to infect other people if I want to do that. I thought that's where you're going with the undermining of trust, how some people don't want to basically or don't care about the other or don't care about the other human being in regards to ensuring that they don't get sick and putting the virus down.
Well, I don't see. That's the thing this is where I've heard like of most of my family particularly, I'll just be upfront about it. On my mom's side of the family, most of them are like, they pretty much take that tack. They're like, if you're not going to wear a mask, you're a jerk. I'm not going to use a couple of the other words that came to mind because I can't say them because the FCC would come down on us, but you're a jerk. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know where you're going.
And I get that argument. But here's the thing is, I feel like a lot of people who don't wear the masks, they just don't believe in the disease. And I can and do criticize that outlook because I do believe that COVID-19 not only exists, but is deadly for a small but significant minority of the population. But I don't think that it's like they're like bad people. I just think that they think this is all a big overreaction. This is either planned or it was responded to poorly, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know, maybe that's too much empathy here, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know.
What is the conversation
you totally
could take off air? You and I always have this conversation off air where I think I often say, I understand you're empathizing. Like even with me, like when you and I have gotten arguments and I came back and I was like, dude, I'm so sorry, my bad. And you was like, well, I didn't, things might have been going on in your life. And what is my response? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Like you can empathize and you can try to understand what people come from. And sometimes the empathy matters more. Meaning sometimes where that person is coming from matters more than what the person did, where you can have a certain degree of understanding. In other cases, you can empathize and it doesn't matter at all. And this is one of those cases where I feel like it's like, yeah, I can kind of empathize if people say they don't believe it, but to me that doesn't matter. I mean, there are nearly 2,000 people dying a day. We have, 8 million, 10 million people infected by the virus, and the numbers are going up. And the president is eye off the ball and doesn't seem to care. And so you have some people in this community that believes in Trump, backs Trump completely, even to the degree where reality doesn't matter. And so it's like, I get it that it's not that they are horrible people. It's not that per se. But it's hard for me to come to a conclusion that they're not selfish or they don't care about other people if they themselves are not. Like, I see what you mean when you're saying, look, it's just they don't believe it. But does it matter? I mean, especially when you have this number of people dying.
Well, I guess, and maybe this is my weakness, is that I like to feel like I can connect with other people or something like that. So I like try to, you try to preemptively imagine what are they going through? What's the mental thought process here? Right. And then you like feel like you can connect with that in some way. And that gives you power in your relationship because then you feel like you're able to have a conversation with them. And similarly, I mean, frankly, I feel like we're missing this in politics. I feel like on a deep level, this is what you want from a statesperson, not just a leader, not just a president, but somebody who can unify a state. you need somebody who can sort of understand the different sides of the elephant and how the different, constituents of society, different members of society, different groups and different perspectives, all nevertheless at the end of the day cohere into some unified vision of what reality is. And I don't know, man. I don't know.
No, I agree with you.
Maybe
It's
I'm making too
necessary
much of it.
politically. I mean, do you remember the protests? And Biden comes out and is like, we need to stop the protests. And I was like, oh, that's a horrible answer. Like, the better answer would have been to try to speak to both sides. I understand where this came from the, like, think of what Obama would have did. Okay, don't think about what Obama would have did. But this idea of being able to say, I understand why you guys are angry. I understand how this comes from. I understand the things in historical context that allows a community to get to this level. Explain it. Have the conversation. And then also make the converse of saying, it is also wrong for these businesses to be torched. It is also wrong, for these people who actually might back you and who are in your community. You need to be able to speak to both in order to bring both together. And so I get it where you're coming from, and I agree with you 1,000%.
I hear you.
But we don't have that in our politics.
We don't have that, and part of it is we're having a lot of fun with this conversation. We got so many other headlines to go through, but I'm just going to keep this up. We're going to miss out on a lot of them, sadly. But I mean, if you're living in an increasingly low trust society, if you're living in a society where you assume the worst about what the other person is saying, then if you try to unify the people, if you try to speak to the different sides, each side is sort of going to hear what you're doing, and they're going to be like, he's betraying me, or like he secretly believes the opposite of what he's explicitly saying, and I can tell because he's being friendly to the people I don't like. You see what I'm saying? And I feel like that's happening all the freaking time. And people can talk about social media and how it makes it worse. I think something we sort of disregard is how our lack of trust in our political institutions and frankly each other, just prima facie on its face, that makes it worse too. That makes it a lot worse. Anyway.
The problem is, if you have a society where everyone tells the truth, just assume it for the moment, everybody tells the truth. No one knows what lying even is. And one guy develops a superpower to lie. He develops an ability.
I think there was a movie.
Yeah, there's a movie.
I think there's a movie with that.
He has a kid. That kid develops the ability to lie. And eventually you have one side of the population that can lie and does so well and ends up with this kind of advantage. But what happens to the rest of the society when it realizes that another aspect of that society can lie and that they themselves also have that ability, even if they don't necessarily like to use that ability? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it creates a certain degree of distrust in the political system the moment that you realize that somebody has the capacity to say something that is not true. And when you see that proliferates, because I don't believe this was this way in like the 50s. Like, when the guys on news said something, the public took it. That was it, right? If Tom Brokaw said X, then Tom Brokaw said X. That's true. That's reality. That's what it is. And then you get competing points of view, competing perspectives, and then you have those things challenging and fighting and eating each other with the extra added bonus that some don't believe what they're actually saying. Meaning they're not saying it because it's true. They're saying it to make the appearance of an argument, to allow their particular tribe, their particular side to say something in contest to actual flat fact reality. Like, it creates a race to the bottom. It creates a distrust, fundamental distrust in our system, whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right. I don't know how to fix that. Like, I mean, I think that's the problem. When talking to Daniel, I kept thinking, oh, we're screwed. We're screwed. Because I don't, like, do you trust the congressmen or people in Congress right now, in the House, let's say even in state houses, all across the United States, to open up the Constitution in order to make changes? And what do you think those guys will put in it if they had the opportunity to do so? Would you even trust Obama to do it?
And none of us trust.
Yeah, nobody trusts that.
And we were having that conversation with Daniel, and I was kind of open to the idea of it. But then the thing that kept coming up is, okay, well, but who's going to make those changes? And how do we know that they're just not going to make things worse? And you don't. You know what? We've got to close out. You guys have been listening to Headlines and a lot of conversation with Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Anyway, no, here's the thing. We don't trust him. I mean, the idea that politicians lie and dissemble and deceive is about as old as politics itself. So that's nothing new. But then we've gone through these sort of iterative changes of the form of government. Now we're living in a democracy. Maybe it's an oligarchy, actually. But anyway, each one is said by its sort of founders or its inaugural philosophers to solve a lot of the problems that you can see very clearly in the ones that came before. And at this point, I feel like we're just kind of disenchanted with the whole thing. And I don't know where you go from that. That's on a very basic level. So that's why I'm into farming. I'm into saving up some money, buying some land, ideally attracting a spouse.
You just want to get away from it all. I just want to leave it all.
Yeah, man. I do. I just want to restore some slightly degraded land to leave that land to my kids. Anyway, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going into a break. We'll be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And our guest for this segment and the next, Kim Iverson. She is an independent journalist and host of The Kim Iverson Show on YouTube, which you can check out, by the way. Just go to youtube.com/Kim Iverson. Kim, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for having me, guys.
Hey, thanks so much for being with us. All right. We're going to talk about we're just sort of continuing this conversation, as we sadly so often do. We're doing our headlines, and then we get into sort of an extended 5 to 6 minute long conversation about philosophy or political philosophy or psychology or whatever it is. It started out with COVID. So we're talking about lockdowns and a lack of trust in American society. This is a natural segue in its own way into one of your more recent and more controversial videos. Very excited to be talking about this. For folks listening, you can go check this out on Kim's YouTube channel. The title of the video is "Stop Advocating for Lockdowns. Our Ancestors Risked Their Lives for Economic Opportunity." Quote, end quote. That is fiery. Kim, I'm going to hand it over to you. Why did you frame it in that sense? And why do you think it's important to view the lockdowns with that historical perspective in mind?
Well, first of all, I wasn't sure which video you were referring to when you said one of your most controversial, because I feel like all of them are. So I was waiting to see which one are you going to talk about. I mean, listen, I think that for many of us in America, it has, I think the reason I phrase it that way is because I think there's just been a lack of connection with our immigrant ancestors and the understanding of why so many of our immigrant ancestors came over. Now, obviously, that's not the case for everybody. Some immigrants came for very different reasons. For one, enslaved people didn't have a choice at all, so I understand that. And there are some immigrants that were coming for, maybe totally different reasons altogether. But many, many people that built this country came over because they were suffering from some kind of oppression, or they wanted some sort of, they didn't feel like they could achieve, and they literally were willing to risk their lives in order to come over here. And I think it's just, people advocate for these lockdowns, and they say, and I hear this all the time. Where they just say, oh, you want people to risk their lives for money. You want people to risk their lives for their businesses, for the economy. How selfish are you? How awful are you? And it's just such a backwards mentality, because so many people, that is exactly what they did. They risked their lives. They swam across the Rio Grande to get here in order to hopefully have economic opportunity. In Germany, people from East Germany would dodge over the East German guards trying to get around them in order to get to a place that they felt was going to be more prosperous. My ancestors, my mother, my Vietnamese family, they came here and they escaped, many on boats, and risked their lives in order to get to a place. And it was for economic gain. A lot of people, they think, oh no, they were oppressing, they were fleeing a war with oppression, and it was either they leave or it was their lives, and that's not accurate. Of course, people don't want to live in a war zone for sure. War is something that people flee, but people flee what they believe that the new regime is going to be marching in to their lives, and they don't want to live under oppression. They don't want to live under control. They want to have freedom, and economic freedom is a big aspect of that.
Kim, I agree with you that people leave war zones or people leave other areas in order to have a certain degree of, let's call it freedom, but in this case, let's define it. This idea of either economic liberty, this ability to go as they please and have a better life for themselves and their kids. And I agree with you. An aspect of that is being able to buy things, right? To be able to have a house, a certain level of stability and security in regards to going about your affairs. Agreed. However, I don't see how it's relevant to the conversation of COVID, one way or the other. Meaning, it doesn't matter to me if somebody came over into the country for some level of economic freedom. That's irrelevant to the point of whether or not people should be forced to go into work or should be forced to go into school dealing with death. I mean, for God's sake, we have like nearly 2,000 people a day are dying. That number is going to go up to 2,500. And we're talking about, 250,000. And there is zero control of this. So this is not even a situation where you have an administration that is even attempting or pretending to control it. They had the task force recently, and these guys leave without answering any questions. In fact, and I just made the point to Shane, that Mnuchin is talking about pulling the funds to make it that much more difficult for the incoming administration to deal with COVID. And so I understand that the intention of immigrants might have been to get a better economic place, but I don't see how that's relevant in any order in regards to policy that should take place in dealing with COVID-19. What do you think about it?
Well, because first of all, you know that the government isn't going to do anything. You know this. You absolutely, 100%, without a doubt, know that the government will not come along and support everybody. And if you know that, then how could you advocate for people to be forced to lose everything knowing the government will not bail them out? That, well, okay, let's just all take the hit. The mentality seems to be, let's just all take the hit, and then maybe that will force them to do something for us. And that, that's asking everybody to jump off the bridge together, right. Hoping that some miracle will happen just doesn't seem realistic to me. But so I've got three kind of things on this. The second one is, my point on that is when this is all over and when this all shakes out and when thousands upon thousands of people have lost their businesses that they've built, and when millions of people have lost their jobs and people are on the brink of losing their homes or do lose their homes, many of them will, I think those folks will look back and they will say, I would have rather risked my life than lose everything I built. I mean, I've got my aunt, for example, she's on the brink of losing everything. She started her businesses, this is from my Vietnamese side of the family, risked everything to come over here. She took every dime she had from waitressing. She started up a business in 1988. And now, because of these enforced shutdowns, she's potentially going to lose everything. She is now 65 years old. What is she going to do when she loses everything? She can't go get a job. She can't rebuild at 65 years old. That's a joke. So look, when she's looking at it, she's been out there protesting the lockdown because she's saying, how can you do this to me? I'm willing to just risk it at 65 years old. I'd rather risk it. She's got children and grandchildren that she has to look out for. So I think people, when they look back, when they lose their businesses, like this old Korean couple who just had to shut down their market right across from where I live, they're in their 60s. There's no way they can rebuild. They're looking back and they're thinking, they're thinking, actually, I risked it once and I definitely would rather risk it again. But the third thing I want to bring up is you just said something. I actually haven't heard anybody say this really clearly before. And so it kind of makes me curious. Why do you think when you phrase it, when you say, why should people be forced to go to work or forced to go to school? I don't think any of us that are against lockdowns are talking about forcing people to go to school or go to work. I think many of us are saying it should be your choice. Whether if you want to shelter in place and you want to lock down and you want to lose everything, doing that. That should absolutely be a choice of yours to have. I don't think people are saying you should be forced to go. We're just saying we don't want to be forced not to.
I guess if you look at what took place, because if you look at what took place, many of these employers aren't singular unto themselves. Meaning it's not a situation where the individual just owns the company and that individual runs the company entirely by themselves. In many of these areas, go back and look at what Trump was doing in some of these areas where they were trying to force people back to work in the meat industry. You had a cacophony of people with COVID-19 dying from this stuff, and yet they were still trying to force people to go back into work. I mean, the catch is you may have some businesses where an individual can run the business entirely by themselves. But if you're talking about other companies like Amazon and whatnot, I have a hard time believing that the policy is going to make a distinction between individuals. It's probably going to be a broad stroke. Either people are allowed to work or they're not, which is why I lean on the side. And by the way, I am not this hawk for lockdowns. I'm sick of being in the house, so being all that honest. And if we can find any way around it other than that, I am for it. So this is not a situation where I'm like, yes, lockdowns. That's not where I am. But I guess I'm saying I do understand the logic of it in regards to a worsening situation that seems completely and entirely uncontrolled. I also accept your point that the government is not going to do anything. And because the government is not going to do anything, that basically it leaves people in these dire straits. Meaning, if you tell people to lock down, you have to, like logically, you have to step in to ensure that those people are made whole. And you're right. As we've seen over the last several months, the government just basically didn't care. So I think that's a fair point. But I do think it's also a fair point to say that various people, the government or various states, especially Republican states, are not going to do this piecemeal stuff where they're going to have it half and half, that people can make a choice on whether they go back to work or not. If anything, it is going to be people either go back to work or they don't. And that was the pattern that we were seeing when they were using the unemployment benefits and everything else to try to force people back into those jobs. Am I wrong? I mean, that did happen.
It's already like that. I mean, the thing is that this notion that we could lock down has been, I mean, you needed the grocery stores to be open. So imagine if every grocery store and every farmer and every trucker and every Amazon worker, you know, imagine if all of them said, okay, we're going into lockdown. So that means we all get to go lock down. The grocery store worker then says, wait, why do I have to go to work? I thought we were going into lockdown. So I'm supposed to stay home and stay safe. That we already did this. We already did a bunch of the U.S. economy has to remain open because they are considered, quote unquote, essential workers. That was bull, guys. I mean, look, if we're going to force a bunch of people to go to work and say, sorry, but you don't have a choice. I mean, when it comes to those meat factories, of course they had to go to work. How were people going to eat? It was, you know, yes, I get it. One guy or 10 or 20 or even 100 have to risk their lives. But you're talking about 330 million Americans that if they don't eat will starve to death. I mean, you can't have that scenario realistically. There unfortunately does have to be a bit of a Sophie's choice. And so that we already did that. It wasn't a real lockdown. It was a fake lockdown. And it was only meant to make those who could lock down feel safe, while we did throw a lot of other people, millions upon millions of people, under the bus essentially in that regard. And I feel like we should have all been there under the bus with them, because many people would have absolutely chosen instead to go do that. If they could have, they were unfortunate that their business was not considered essential. You know how many businesses I went to, and the business owner, I'd say, how are you doing? And they would say, luckily for me, they would actually use that phrase, luckily for me, my business is considered essential. That's the phrase they used. It wasn't, oh no, unfortunately for me, my business is essential. You'll never hear that from anybody. You're going to hear, luckily for me, my business was essential.
I do accept that business owners, all things being equal, would want to keep their businesses open. It's the way they make their profits. So I don't doubt that. I guess I'm looking at it from the standpoint of people who have to work at those businesses. And if it was a fake lockdown, then there's no issue here, right? This is not a fake lockdown. There are areas that are essential. I agree with you. I mean, people need the ability to get food. They need the ability to get drink. So there are things that people need. By the same token, there are things that they don't. And if you're working at Old Navy, I don't necessarily need a suit right now, nor do I need to necessarily force workers to go and risk their lives to sell, a T-shirt or whatever. But let's do this. Let's come back into the next so we can continue to fight over this, or we can pivot into something else. This is Kim Iverson, independent journalist and host of the Kim Iverson Show on YouTube. You can watch Kim's show on YouTube at youtube.com/Kim Iverson and follow her on her new Twitter account at Kim Iverson Show. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Kim Iverson. She's an independent journalist and host of the Kim Iverson Show on YouTube. You should go check that out. Kim, we're talking about the economic lockdown in the last segment. I actually want to continue that, pick that up on the other side of this. It seems like this is in some sense been delegated. The argument, the controversy has been delegated to the public, where you have these two sort of wings of American society, loud wings, one calling for more lockdowns, one sort of sees this whole thing as either a planned emergency or simply an opportunistically seized on emergency where basically governments around the world are increasing their power. I can see the different sides that each of those wings has. I get their perspectives. Broadly, it seems like there's this sort of silent middle in here that's just kind of getting along, just doing what they have to do, and doesn't really want to get involved in that fray. But the whole thing, as far as I can tell, isn't the political system as a whole complicit in not doing nearly enough to prepare for this? Isn't that sort of the unspoken real source and real opportunity to not just improve our society, but our political system itself? Like, in other words, society as a whole is arguing. The public is arguing with itself. You have certainly Democrats and Republicans blaming each other for their respective mishandlings of this crisis, but isn't the entire political system? We've had years to prepare for this. Since SARS, since MERS, specifically with the coronavirus family of viruses, you've had opportunities to prepare for something like this. Like, couldn't we have done a lot more? Isn't that the sort of unspoken source of potential improvement, the unspoken criticism that we could make? I don't know. Kim, what's your take?
Yeah, for sure we could have always prepared a little bit more. It's hard to prepare for things, though, when you don't know what that enemy is yet. It's like, yeah, hindsight's 20/20, but remember, nobody knew what would be hitting us. They didn't know if it was a virus, what kind of virus, how would it infect people, those unknowns. But I think the real failure has been the response. Again, it kind of goes back to the response being that the solution is a lockdown, rather than, a lockdown should buy you time to come up with a solution like build hospitals. We should have been building COVID-specific hospitals. We should have been ramping up our medical sector, similar to what we did with the military and how we actually created the military-industrial complex after World War I and II. That is what we should have been doing, is just saying, all right, we're going to convert factories now and turn them into, PPE gear making companies, and we're gonna pump out medical equipment, medical gear. We're gonna give everybody certified. All these people who don't have a job now, certify them for nursing jobs or medical. Obviously not. It would be temporary emergency, right? Emergency certifications to help out. We could have built up our medical sector, and then the great thing about that is we would have ended up with a medical industrial complex that they would have needed to keep going, which would have probably given us something I want, which is Medicare for all.
1,000% agree, Kim. 1,000% agree. I agree, breathtakingly agree on that. Because you're right. Donald Trump knew about this going all the way up to February. And it basically was a drop of the ball. Let me ask you this. If the government did that, meaning held the lockdown just to get enough time, or to buy itself time to try to find a larger solution for it, would you have been in favor of the temporary lockdowns then? Because I agree with you. The lockdown shouldn't necessarily be a solution. That's not really a solution. That's more of a means to an end, just to kind of get you through a patch, not the end result of the patch, if that makes sense. So from your standpoint, would you have backed it for a short period of time if it was one of those things where the government was ramping up production and so forth? Especially if the government even took the tack that says, look, we're going to cover you guys in the meantime.
Yeah, I would have been in favor of lockdowns in two cases. One, if we did it the Chinese style, right at the very beginning, and it was like, look, we've got an opportunity to actually extinguish the virus and to eradicate it from mankind, then that would have been something that maybe, we could have somehow done. But that's usually done by closing down borders, not so much necessarily inside the community, unless you already have spread in the community. But we would have had to done it very aggressively, the same way China did, with pulling people out of their homes and sticking them in a quarantine facility, things like that. But, maybe that could work. We were past that point. So the second thing is, I would have been for a lockdown, okay with the lockdowns for sure. If it was, look, we need 3 weeks and we've got this plan, and here's this hospital we're going to build, and here's the PPE gear that we're going to roll out, or here's the therapeutic or whatever it is that they think they have. And we just need this many weeks to get the production done. And then there's an expiration point to this lockdown. And we're going to also make sure that, we give you the money you need for these 3 weeks. I think that would have been reasonable, more reasonable. People still would complain, about their lack of liberty for sure, but it would have been much more reasonable. I mean, how many months now are we into this? And I live in California, where we never really fully opened back up. Many sectors are still totally, pretty much totally closed.
Something like 8 at this point, right? 8 months. I think it was like mid-March that the lockdowns kicked into effect, depending on what part of the country you're in. It's a long time, 2/3 of a year. I mean, here's the thing, though. We're still within the sort of span of predicted lockdown periods. They were saying it might last until this winter, could last into next year. Could at this point, looking forward to it. Seems at the very earliest, this upcoming, early spring at the earliest, I would say, based on the whole flu season thing kicking back into effect. Kim, I like your response on that. I agree. I think Medicare for All, something like that, if we had sort of built up our productive capacities in the medical industry, in the same way that people not going to school right now are going to school virtually is triggering a lot of conversation about potentially reforming the education system. It's like every crisis is potentially an opportunity if you seize onto it in the right way, if you have the right perspective on this stuff. Again, I would level a lot of criticism against our political establishment for failing to seize on that. On the other hand, I mean, Trump was talking about invoking the Defense Authorization Act to create ventilator factories and all this stuff back then. I remember people criticizing him and calling him, as they're wont to do, a fascist for trying to turn the wheels of government to try to solve this problem. Wouldn't that happen in any event? And this is from the perspective of the public, but whether it's a Democrat or a Republican sitting in the presidential seat, sitting in the Oval Office, isn't that just going to be a huge, huge minority of the population that rejects any resolution of our problems, any real sustained effort to solve whatever problem we face, particularly a crisis as significant as this one? And if so, feel free to correct me if you think I'm wrong about that one, but if so, how the heck do we get out of that lack of trust? How the heck do we move on to the other side of that? Kim?
Well, if I had an answer for that question, I could probably make a bunch of money selling a book, right? I mean, knowing how to heal this, we've got a major divide in our country between the two sides. And yes, if Joe Biden were the one sitting in that chair at the time that all of this unleashed, he would be absolutely called, the dictator, the communist, socialist, or whatever that's bringing in, controlling our lives like communist China. I don't think there's any escaping that, unfortunately, right now. And, I experience that even on my own channel. If I will say good things about Donald Trump, and I just get eviscerated by people. I mean, my channel has lost like 2,000 subscribers ever since I started saying even something nice about Donald Trump. I mean, our country is so divided. It's crazy. I don't know how we get out of this, but we have got to. We have to somehow get together and stop demonizing the other as some group that's going to march in the worst of the worst.
Yeah, Kim, I thought it was just me. I lost like 200 over the course of X amount of time. But I don't necessarily know why. I mean, mine could have just been because I was out of commission for like a month or so. But I do know that I have taken a certain position against the left in regards to the way that they behaved during this election, basically kowtowing to Biden with no expectation of getting anything for it. And now these guys are complaining with this kind of buyer's remorse of, oh, Joe Biden is putting in these people who are dumping chemicals and these people who are against the climate movement. It's like, why did you think he was going to do anything different? So I feel you on that part. I thought it was just me, oddly enough. Why do you think that people have gotten so ensconced in their tribe like this? Like where, you can't even call reality. Otherwise, they look at you as trespassing in some kind of weird way. Because I never took you as a party person. And so the idea that people are attacking you for saying something positive about Donald Trump is kind of out there. Like, how do we get here? And maybe that's the more interesting question in trying to figure out a way. How do we get out, if there is a way out at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've just had a slippery slope down in our government from, I don't know when we could trace it back to maybe the 70s when there were some financial shifts that happened under Nixon, or maybe it was Newt Gingrich when he became speaker, and some of the new policies that he implemented that kind of created this slow deterioration of people losing, for one, the wealth inequality growing because of the policies under Nixon. And then, the wealth inequality, when people become less happy, obviously, they become more divisive naturally. That's one thing, too, I was watching these Senate hearings where they're blaming Facebook and Twitter, for the division in our country, right? They say, well, it's your fault because you allow misinformation to spread on your platforms and you don't stop hate. And the hate is, now we're seeing a rise in hate crimes. And I sat there watching this and I thought, why are these politicians blaming social media for the rising, people being unhappy and that clearly manifesting in a variety of different ways, from civil unrest to hate crime? They blame social media rather than themselves. They're 100%. The ones who are not giving us the lifestyles that we deserve with our tax dollars and policies. And then they wonder, oh, no, it's social media's fault. They put the blame everywhere else except for on themselves. They're a government on the take. And Americans know it somewhere deep in their core, whether they know it like you and we all know it. But other people, they feel it. They don't really quite know. They just think it's, okay, well, it must be the Nazis then, or it must be the racists, or it must be the communists that are coming. But no, the government's on the take.
It's true. Yeah, my ears perked up when you brought it back to the early 70s. I think you could have been referring to a number of things. Nixon's domestic policies. I would also throw in the Nixon shock, the fundamental change in the nature of the dollar. That goes off into its own tangent. But broadly, early 70s, mid 70s. Since then, we've had long-term wage stagnation. In some sense, if you're not baking more pies, if the pie isn't growing, if you're stuck in this sort of zero-sum game, despite the fact that there are more and more people being born into the country, entering the country, there's more competition over fewer resources, then your trust is going to get eroded because there's simply not as much to go around. So I think fundamentally, on that deep level, our politicians are probably the class that is most complicit in that set of crimes, if you're going to call them crimes. Anyway, Kim, thank you for joining us. We're about out of time. Anything folks should look forward to coming out on your channel in the next day or so?
Actually, I'm going to address that Senate hearing that they just talked about and kind of expose the government a bit more. But otherwise, no. Thank you guys so much for having me. I always really enjoy being on your guys' show. You're my favorite. I really love our conversations.
In the background, I was sending them. I was like, "Oh, Kim is awesome. I love her." I was like, "I hope she's." I was like, I was pressuring her, so I hope she's not annoyed or crossed at us because pushing back on the position. So I'm glad you said that. Thank you, Kim. We always love it when you're on.
we have to, good lively discussion is great, but I always love our discussions, even when we don't agree. I love it. I love our conversations.
It's great. It's great. And just to back Jamarl up, he was sending that on the back channel. Anyway, Kim, thank you so much for joining us. Kim Iverson, for those listening, independent journalist and host of the Kim Iverson Show on YouTube. Go check that out. YouTube.com/Kim Iverson. And it is spelled Iversen. That's how you spell Iverson. Although if you do a search for her, however you spell it, you'll probably find her pretty quickly. In any event, Kim, thank you again for being with us. We are going into a break. On the other side of this break, we're taking calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back and we're taking calls. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas. That is my co-host, and myself, Shane Stranahan. And our phone lines are open. Our phone banks are patiently waiting your call deposits. The phone number is 202-521-1320. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, what's going on, man?
Good morning, gentlemen. A lot is going on, right? Okay. That guy was on earlier. He needed to debate somebody from LaRouche Pack, Dennis Speed or Harley Snyder. Maybe I can invite one of them on. They can tell you how the intentions of the Constitution was put together was to protect people.
We're talking about, for folks who are just coming in, sorry, Triff, I'm going to hand it right back over to you. You're talking about Daniel Lazar. He was on at 8:30 earlier on in today's show, just to fill people in. Anyway, you were saying.
Yeah, so somebody can come on now, like Dennis Speed or Harley Snyder. They can talk about the Constitution, and they can break it down through the history, why it was developed, and throughout time, those inside the United States were trying to basically destroy it by all types of means. Okay, that's my first thing. I got that.
Tarif, real quick. What of Daniel Lazar's statement do you disagree with, where you believe he needs to debate?
Well, the thing is, he's saying that it's out of date. It's out of date in what way? It's designed for free speech, Second Amendment.
Well, he's saying it's out of date because it lacks the ability to be changed. That the entire point of the Constitution was to create a certain intransigence, an inability for the government to be altered. Like in any country, there's this kind of stick-to-itiveness that's required for a government to maintain its own constitution. By the same token, you still need the ability for that government to be changed. His point is, it lacks the ability to change. The hurdle that's built into it is so great that even though it may be there, that it's almost like a technicality that it's there. It's not something that could be altered. That's his point. Not so much that the Constitution doesn't allow certain things. It's more so that there are times where it needs to be altered. Does it make sense?
I see what you're saying, but I think it's, from my point of view, I see y'all a little bit deeper on this than me, to have Dennis Speed on or Harley Snyder. And they can break it down better than I could. And you just said it to old boy Shane an hour ago, saying, do you trust the people that's going to come up with a new constitution, knowing that what we're going through right now? Come on, let's be real. Okay, let me go on to my other comments. Okay, D-class. What the D-class going to do if he D-class dealing with the I don't agree with everything with Sidney Powell. I back up 90% what you're saying, but when she threw in South America and these other countries. But if a declass come out and say Trump declassed the CIA, how they overthrew other countries. Basically, Dominion, Gambit, Raptor, Skull Cord, Hammer, basically it's going to show the opposite of, it's going to basically show that these countries are being taken over by these cell phone programs, that they're trying to flip it for the Wall Street people, right? So it's going to be something, it's going to help out Trump. At the same time, it's going to tell the truth on how we ran our crews overseas. In other declass, they have to declass on certain things, again, like for the third time, like MK Ultra or some other thing. COINTELPRO, which I think a massive COINTELPRO is being done, but they're pitting the right against the left, using the media on both sides, and basically we have the point of on the verge of a civil war. So if he declares MK Ultra, COINTELPRO, these experiments on the population, and how they got the people in Uganda to fight each other and elsewhere on the planet, then we can read those documents. Then we can stop what's going on right now, and that can help us out. But they got to declare MK Ultra, the software programs like Dominion that was used over the seas, and COINTELPRO, the assassinations of world leaders and also leaders here. All these things will actually help our people to realize that, to be honest with you, majority of them, the Republicans and Democrats, is corrupt. Now, I don't want to say all of them, but it's not the fact about good and evil. Yes, it's a fact about good and evil, but it's about, you got to find out, you got people surrounded Bernie Sanders, right? They have people surrounding Trump. They basically was hamstringing them. They was basically cutting them off by the knees. They was basically destroying them. They did it to Bernie Sanders, and then they started doing it to Trump, so they can bring up the corporatist Democrats again and also the corporatist Republicans to keep them in power. That's all I'm trying to say. That's all. So that's all I got to say for today.
So, Reeve, thank you for the call. Pretty much every time you've called in, I think you said it was like for the last 28 days or something, for about the last month, you've been talking about Trump needing to declassify these documents before he exits the administration, assuming, of course, that he does. It's still up in the air. I can't help but agree, and I get why you're saying it too. Now would be the time. It's like, in his first and apparently last term, sitting as the lame duck president, that's his opportunity. I don't see Biden pushing to do that. I think that would blow a lot of things wide open. Anyway, Tarif, thank you for the call. We have Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey guys, great show today. I got a few things. I'll try to be as quick as possible. First thing, I have a question. A few weeks ago, you guys had a guest on who was talking about, who mentioned the Great Reset during his time on the show, and it kind of sent me off into this thing of researching it. And the more and more I dig into it, I come to this place where I wonder, if you go into news overseas, like Sky News, news out of Australia, news out of the UK, everybody's talking about the Great Reset. Most of these news organizations are talking about the Great Reset heavily. And I was watching something on Sky News at around like 2:00 in the morning this morning, and they were talking about how the Great Reset is actually being advertised at large, like. And it's just weird to me. Well, not weird. I understand why that we're not seeing that at all here in the U.S. Other than maybe a few months back on the Today Show, where one of the former vice presidents was kind of touched on it a bit. So I guess I'm rambling a lot, but I was trying to find out if you guys had any more details on that, or if you guys could remember at some point, maybe post it in the tweet or something, what that gentleman's name was. I want to look more into him. The other thing
I believe it was Tom Luongo. I'm sorry for Brave. I'll let you finish because I hear you were saying more. But I believe that it was Tom Luongo who was talking about Klaus Schwab, the founder of, I believe it's the World Economic Forum, the first founder of that. Anyway, I'm pretty darn sure that was Tom Luongo you were listening to. And that was, again, Tom, Luongo. We'll probably be having him on early this next week. We usually have him on about every 2 weeks. Anyway, you were saying.
Cool. Thank you very much for that. So I made a note. I tend to agree with one. I tend to agree with Kim Iverson. I agree with anything Kim Iverson says for the most part because I love it, right? But that and then to Reef, to his point, I agree with him as well to a certain extent. Your guest earlier, Daniel, I think he kind of jumped the shark, if I can use the term there. The problem is, the Constitution may have its problems, but again, as you guys said, you can't trust the politicians to make decisions. Who can you trust to make the changes? So the real issue is the politicians. The real issue is that we are dead set between the Democrats and the Republican Party. They're not in the Constitution. And I do not understand why we have yet to get rid of them or at least remove their stranglehold on our politics. They are not in the Constitution. A two-party system is not in the Constitution. So before we go changing the Constitution, maybe we need to consider taking action against the Democrat and Republican parties because they are corporations.
Yeah, Brave. I agree with that. I mean, I guess that was kind of my point, right? I was trying to make the point that basically the Constitution does allow itself to be changed. Like, it's not a situation where the document is unchangeable, like it's just a permanent fixture thing. It allows alterations, and the fact that it shows it has amendments. Like, it does have a history of it. I think his point was just, it is so impossible to do, meaning it's such an impossible hurdle. But part of the reason it's an impossible hurdle was because of the people who are in office. Like, it's like a chicken and an egg oddity of sorts.
Catch-22 kind of a thing.
Yeah. It really is.
I hear you completely. Real quick, we have two other callers, and we only have like 4 minutes, three minutes realistically to take them, so I want to get that in. Ideally, we can get Daniel Lazar back on soon and have at least one of the segments as a call-in segment. So to Brave, feel free to call in any event. Louise calling in from Virginia. Louise, you're on. What's going on?
Yes, and ask Tom Luongo what he thinks of changing the Constitution. I'm calling to agree with Brave, with Tarif, and also with Kim Iverson, who's a real sweetheart. She's so clear and she's so good-humored. Talk about common, down-to-earth genius. She is it. And what it is, the politicians are dishonest. You don't have to change the Constitution. You get a bigger mess. We're unique in the history of the universe with a Constitution that says government, the king is not the king. The king is not the king. Why throw that away? Why not try more to get honest politicians and judiciary? Don't throw away something that's unique and good.
I agree. Louise, I agree with you fundamentally, and that's why I was consistently, from my end, I was consistently pushing back on Daniel. I want to hear more of it, though. That was only a short conversation, realistically only 20 minutes or so back and forth. He's written books about it, so I want to hear more of what his thought process is there. But in any event, when it comes down to it, I agree with you. And yeah, Kim was a great guest. Always love having her on. Louise, thank you for the call. We've got Travis calling in from Arizona. Travis, you're on. What's going on?
Good morning, Armenia. I want to just say, first of all, that you guys, aside from informative, you guys have a really exciting show. I wake up and I really look forward to listening to it. I wanted to say that. But secondly, I wanted to say that...
Man, thank you so much. Just real quick. Thank you for saying that.
Okay. I want to suggest that you guys do a segment on numerical probabilities as it relates to politics, specifically voting. I know that I've heard it said that there hasn't really been any evidence uncovered of widespread voter fraud. But I think that people discount the fact that certain numerical anomalies are so exceptional that the occurrence of them in and of themselves constitute evidence. Because if it wasn't for some type of unnatural influence, those numerical probabilities just would not occur, right? And so I just wanted to kind of put that out there that the way the voting apparatus is set up, we may not ever understand why certain anomalies occurred because it's set up to not be clear. It's set up to not be transparent. Neither party wants it to reform it in a way that makes it 100%, gives it 100% integrity or near, or make it transparent. But the fact that if we don't really have any integrity in the voting apparatus, then pretty much any conversation thereafter is moot because you can't even really trust who the hell should have been the president to begin with. But again, just to focus on the probability, the numerical probabilities, and how that potentially could relate to evidence in and of itself.
You're talking about fraud detection. I kind of was talking about this with Benford's Law. I realized after I was looking at it that it doesn't apply. As far as I can tell, Benford's Law would not apply to these districts. They don't have, anyway, that's one specific thing. Broadly, in a broader sense, I completely agree with you. Our electoral system should be more transparent. We should push for that. And it's weird that pretty much every guest we've had on has agreed with that and seems to have done so for decades, and yet more has not been done. Anyway, closing the show out, we'll be back on Monday. You guys have been listening to the most disruptive show in America and across our multiverse. Have a great weekend, folks.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan signing off for the week. This was a really good show today. Really interesting. And it seems, oddly enough, contentious, but in a good way. The back and forth with Daniel Lazare, loved. I think the thing is, there's a middle ground in the argument. Whereas I was trying to get across to Lazare that, are you saying that we don't have the ability to change it? To which he said, well, no, you have the ability to change it. It's just so over the top in trying to do so. But those are different, right? To make the argument that you can't do something versus something is difficult to do, those are two different things. And so I appreciate what he's saying. So that's fair. In the sense that, look, we need the ability to change this Constitution and make it, to something reflective of public will. And we should go to the preamble to do that. But the moment that you blow off the Constitution, you've blown off the Constitution. And choosing the preamble, at that point, is just a choice. It's something that is being done almost for it's like nothing is real at that point, because nothing was real prior. But you've you've jettisoned the thing that the body that organized all of you, and making a choice that says, okay, this other document is going to be the document that we're using. Well, if you're going to do that, you can make a choice that something else that you just write up would do it, or make a choice of something else. Like at that point, it's just purely entirely conceptual thought. You're not moored to anything. So you can do pretty much whatever you want based on public will. I guess the point is, who's going to do that? Who's going to do that? Do you really trust the Republican states? Do you really trust the people who are in office right now with their motives and incentives to do that? And what do you think they'll do if they open the document? Do you think they'll work in the best interest of America? Or do you think they work in the best interest of themselves? Do you trust when Obama came out and they said, look, trust me, I'm Obama. I'm working in your best interest for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. However, you're not going to be able to see the document until 4 years after it's signed. Obama went from pillar to post screaming about how awesome the deal was with GM. I saved the auto companies, etc. He wanted you to know. He was very clear on it. I killed bin Laden. He wanted you to know. He was very clear on it. This TPP deal, you can see it after 4 years. After it's signed. You can see it after it's signed. So wait, you're bragging on this other stuff that you think is awesome, but on this deal, you want to hide it and bury it and not pretend it didn't even exist until after you and the other signatories had already signed the deal. Yeah, because you're giving over our sovereignty, and yeah, you're making it in and around our laws. I guess I'm making the same point about the Constitution issue. If you don't trust Obama, who was supposed to be, screaming hope and change to do the Trans-Pacific Partnership because he's selling you down the river, then why would you trust any of these creatures to open up the Constitution? And what do you think they would do if they got the opportunity to do so? It's one thing to pass a law, it's another thing to pass an amendment. But as a flat fact, the potential for it is there. And so it's like, but his argument wasn't so much that the potential wasn't there. His argument is just, it's difficult. It's a hurdle. And the hurdle should not be that high in order to change things. And the very structure of the system itself is basically designed to make it impossible to change it. Okay. Well, yes, it's difficult. No, it's not impossible. Which I guess is the basic flat fact point. So it was a great guest, though. I would love to have him back on. I thought it was a fascinating conversation because at the end of it, he's talking about a revolution. That's why it was in the back. I was like, wait, he's talking about a revolution. The moment that you say the Constitution no longer applies, then the Constitution no longer applies. Who chooses that? Who decides that? Are you going to have a majority of the population that's going to be on board with that? You can't even change the Second Amendment. How are you going to change the rest of the document? That's a war. That's what we're talking about, right? Unless our population changes their point of view and changes their mind And fact of the matter is, if your population did change its mind and did change its point of view and did get to a certain more rational way of being, then the Constitution would work, and it would allow itself to be altered, and it would be able to be changed to make it more suitable for itself to be altered and those type of things. But conceptually, this country is not there. It's just not there. We're not talking about kings and queens. I'm just saying, today's show was badass. Wesley Walker Jr. Thanks, man. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. I enjoyed it myself. I thought it was combative. But combative in a good way. No, I thought it was good. I thought it was a really good show. The Constitution doesn't apply. People who write, enforce, and interpret their positions of power applies. Yes. Because keep in mind, one of the conversations that came up was the fudgeability of it, meaning language is always fudgeable. Oftentimes you have these huge contracts because they try to get out of any weaseling. But when you think about when people talk, people are giving you what's in them. And they're giving you their cues, their understandings of those things. But the words that they use is infused with something that you don't have access to. And it's them. Meaning internally, what they think and the way they say a word, what that word means to them is unique to them. You may be able to approximate it. You may have something that comes close to it. But at the end of the day, there's a subjectivity used in the way that people use their language. Well, what does that look like when you come into law? This is not software. When I'm writing software and code, the interpreter is very specific in what I am saying when I'm trying to write that code. But what about law? Any little bit, especially from the standpoint of liberals, they flex and pull the language in order to make it fit what they want, but so do conservatives. And so what you end up with are these fudgeable language that whoever's in power uses it for their ends. Why do you think they fight so hard for the Supreme Court? Why? Because they want the person to interpret it in a way that suits their political whims and their political ambitions. And fact of the matter is, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you're basically vying for the exact same side with a modicum of degrees and certain identity issues that you may care about. No, I think it's a fair point to say something needs to be changed. Form does affect outcome. So it's not entirely right to say that the Constitution and the way that it's organized doesn't have any effect on that system structure. Clearly it does. But the question becomes, how much effect? And, is it the sole determining factor in the way it acts and those type of things? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Jamal, would you go on status quo or segment if it's small? Yeah, of course. I like Jordan. Jordan's badass. He's been on my show once, I think, and I think I've been on his show once. So, yeah, Jordan is awesome. Jordan is awesome and a great reporter. Oh, by the way, also, they were at a press conference with Giuliani when Giuliani was making those claims, when he was like waving the stuff like that. And Jen was able to get a really good question where Giuliani was like, what fake news do you come from? Like, Giuliani flipped the fuck out. Very wild. Very wild. Very, very wild. Very strange. All right, so I'm going to end this here. And you are going to see me all day. I'm trying to get back to normal. Like I said, we had lost a lot of subscribers and all. But I think a lot of that stuff had to do with the amount of time that I was away and the amount of time I was ill. And things are, to some degree, I guess, trying to get back to normal. There's still a few things, but all things being equal, it's trying to resolve. And I guess I'm trying to resolve. So I'm going to end this. This was a damn good show today. And I'm going to see you guys in a very few. Definitely slam that like button, smash that share button. And I will see you guys probably 20 minutes. Thanks all.